The wind was colder in the past, or perhaps Bran simply felt it more keenly as he sank deeper into the ancient memory of the weirwood. There was a hush to the air that did not exist in his own time, as if the sky itself held its breath, awaiting the clash of swords that would echo from a lonely tower beneath the dawnlight. Bran hovered in that swirling darkness of the Greenseer's vision, half aware of the underground chamber where his body sat curled and unmoving. His eyes, somewhere in the present, had turned milky white the moment he slipped into the roots. Now, the rustle of leaves in an impossibly distant breeze brushed against his senses, guiding him through time's winding paths. He could almost hear the voice of the three-eyed raven whispering that the past was set, that some things could not be changed. But that voice was faint, like an echo in a dream. Bran willed himself deeper, ignoring the queasy pull at the pit of his stomach that made him fear he might lose himself. He told himself he was ready. The desire to see his father once more was a tight coil in his chest, a yearning that had only grown with each new revelation. Now he might see him face to face, not as a distant figure in a courtyard or a fleeting shadow in the crypts, but as the young man who had fought for his sister's life. Or so the stories went. That story was wrapped in a swirl of rumor and half-truth, a swirl that circled around a tower at dawn's early light. Bran had glimpsed the Tower of Joy once before in a half-formed vision, fleeting shapes wearing white cloaks, the glint of swords in the sun, and the echo of Ned Stark's voice calling out names. And then blood. But before Bran could witness anything more, the vision slipped like sand through his fingers, leaving him with only the memory of his father's sorrow. Now, he was determined to return. He felt the lines of power that coursed through the ancient weirwood grove, felt them tug at his spirit as if testing him, deciding whether to allow him passage or cast him back to the present. He held fast, calling on the knowledge the three-eyed raven had imparted, focusing his mind, summoning the stillness in his heart. In the world of leaves and memory, distance meant nothing. A single step through the roots could lead him to centuries gone. He had done it before, if only for a moment, seen glimpses of young Ned Stark, or listened to a voice long dead. There, in the swirling patterns of bark and sap, in the labyrinth of wood that entwined all trees known to the old gods, Bran Stark took another bold step. He felt himself descend past entire decades, a shimmering swirl of images flickering around him. He glimpsed the faces of his ancestors, the silhouettes of kings, the swirl of winter storms, the faint sound of deerwolves howling in the cold nights of the north. And then he felt the shift. He stood as if on a high rampart, invisible and weightless, looking down upon a lonely mountaintop where a squat, forlorn tower rose from the scorched ground. The sky was pale with the first glimmer of dawn. The land around was silent, and the air was dry, lacking the moisture Bran was accustomed to in the north. It felt strange, unreal, and yet he recognized the scene, the Tower of Joy. Before him the Kingsguard stood in their gleaming white armor, swords drawn. Sir Geralt Hightower, the White Bull himself, formidable and calm, his hair silver beneath his helm. Sir Oswa Went, with his dark eyes and measured stance. And Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, blade in hand, that legendary sword Dawn shimmering with the faint hue of starlight. Bran could sense the tension, thick as a thundercloud, teetering on the edge of the moment. Ned Stark, younger than Bran had ever seen him outside the scattered visions, stood with Howland Reed and a handful of companions. Dust clung to their boots and the edges of their cloaks. Their eyes were grim, bearing the sorrow of long wars and lost kings. Bran's heart surged at the sight of his father alive and unmarked, dark hair hanging loose around his lean face. He had seen Ned in fleeting glimpses before, standing by a heart tree or smiling at his sister's mischief, but never like this, clad in steel and ringmail, staring down Kingsguard knights with wariness and resolve. Bran's ghost-like perspective drifted closer, half floating in the air. Though intangible, he felt the tremor of fear that rippled through the men as the swords were lifted. This was the moment, Bran recalled, when all but Ned and Howland would die. He remembered the old stories told in hushed voices. The Kingsguard were the finest knights in the realm. Arthur Dayne alone was worth many men, and they fought to protect something within the tower behind them. Or someone. Bran tried to focus. In the original memory, his father's voice echoed. "I looked for you on the trident," he had said, or something like that, stepping forward. He heard those very words now, as if from somewhere behind him, though he saw Ned's lips move. The young lord wore no helm, and his face, though set in determination, was softer than the man Bran had known in Winterfell. He was not so weathered by years of worry and rule, nor by the heartbreak that was soon to come. Yet heartbreak was etched even now into his eyes, a sorrow for the near end of a civil war that had cost so many lives. Bran felt a rush of emotion to see his father at that precise moment. So alive, so resolute. If only he could speak to him, tell him that he was not alone, that his son watched from decades yet to come. A swirl of wind kicked up dust around them, a final hush before the storm of blades. The King's Guard did not move from their place. They were knights sworn to protect the secret in the tower. The older Bran had listened to Mira and Jojen speak of these men, how they were bound by oath to the Targaryen line, and would not yield. Bran hovered, time seeming to slow, as Arthur Dayne turned his head slightly and locked eyes with Ned. Then the first blow came, sudden and sharp, steel striking steel with a ring that echoed off the stones of the mountain pass. Bran felt his heart pound. He had come here not just to watch. The memory had told him this was a slaughter, that Ned would only survive by the narrowest margin, by the sacrifice of his friends, by Howland's cunning, by luck and the relentless will that Ned possessed. But for the first time, Bran felt that intangible thread that tied him, as a greenseer, to the living. The three-eyed raven had once cautioned him that the past was not a tapestry to be torn at will. Even so, something inside Bran stirred, a voice of his own forging, reminding him of all that had been lost to war, of all the heartbreak, of his father's fate in King's Landing years later. The Tower of Joy might be a pivot in the swirl of destiny, if there was even the faintest chance that he could shift its course. Blades flashed and Bran watched in horror as Sir Gerald Hightower's greatsword bit into the torso of one of Ned's companions, Ethan Glover perhaps, or Martin Castle. It was hard to see in the chaos. The man cried out and stumbled. Blood splashed onto the rocky ground. In an instant, the other Kingsguard knights were upon them, fighting with the deadly skill that had made them legends. Ned's men were no cravens, but they were outmatched. Bran recalled how swiftly they fell. He wanted to scream out a warning. He felt his spirit pulse with a sudden urgency. It was as if he could sense each heartbeat on that field, each droplet of sweat and blood. He reached out with a power he had only tested once or twice, something even the three-eyed raven had not fully guided him through. A greenseer could watch. A warg could slip into animals, and with great mastery, into men. But to do so in the past, that was as dangerous as wandering blindly into the lair of a sleeping dragon. The old warnings rang faintly in Bran's mind, cautioning him that to meddle in the past might unravel his own self. Yet the sight of his father's friend collapsing under the weight of a mortally deep wound spurred Bran on. The echo of steel on steel made him ache with the memory of losing his home, his brothers, his father, all the shattered pieces of House Stark. He reached out more firmly, letting his mind roam across the field. For a second, he hovered near Ned. He could see every line of tension in his father's stance, that guarded stance that tried to anticipate the swirl of Arthur Dayne's legendary blade. Sir Arthur was dancing among them, carving arcs of brilliance through the air. Ned was forced to parry desperately, stepping over the body of one of his fallen men as he struggled to find an opening. The Sword of the Morning fought with a calm ferocity, a dedication born from unbroken vows. Bran's perspective flitted to Howland Reed. Small, quiet, determined, he lingered at the fringes, knife in hand, looking for a moment to strike or to protect. Another of Ned's friends rushed forward, only to be knocked to the ground by Sir Oswald's quick slash, leaving Ned and Howland increasingly isolated. Bran felt the tightness in his own chest. He could see how hopeless it was. The stories said only Ned and Howland would remain when the bloody dawn ended. He tried to push himself a little more, a strangled cry in his throat, as though he might manifest a voice in the wind. The men could not hear him. They had no notion of the spectral observer among them, drifting with the swirling dust. Still the fight raged, with echoes of Ned's labored breathing and the grit of dust underfoot. His father's face was set in grim determination, the same face that would, years later, watch over Winterfell with quiet strength. Bran felt his longing intensify. There must be a way. He thought of Hodor, how he had once touched the gentle giant's mind in the past. How in doing so, he had changed something he did not fully comprehend. Might he do so again here? He heard the faint memory of the three-eyed raven's warning. The ink is dry. But was it truly? He reached for Ned, first as if testing the water. In that moment, an image fluttered in Bran's mind. A boy, small and dark-haired, running through the halls of Winterfell, trailing after a father whose eyes were warm and reassuring. The love he felt for his father overwhelmed him. The swirling chaos of the fight threatened to drown him in blood and fear. Yet he forced himself to focus. He tried to call out, "Father," into the swirling currents of the past. For an instant, Ned's sword arm twitched, as if he had heard something. But the man's attention was quickly ripped away by the deadly approach of Sir Arthur Dayne. Their blades clashed in a furious dance. Dayne's white cloak flared behind him like a banner of fire. Ned was pressed backward, teeth gritted. A single slip would mean his death. In the next heartbeat, Ned tripped on loose gravel. His stance wavered. Sir Arthur brought Dawn slashing down with lethal precision. Bran saw his father raise his sword in a desperate block. Steel rang on steel, but the force of the blow sent Ned staggering. Through the swirl of dust, Bran saw the glint in Arthur Dayne's eyes. The sorrowful acceptance of a knight forced to kill a man he perhaps respected, for a cause that demanded it. Something in Bran snapped. He threw his consciousness forward, a wave of desperate power. Like leaping off a cliff into black water, he cast himself into the flow. In an instant, he felt a wrenching sensation, a ghostly tearing, as if he were pushing against the unyielding walls of time itself. He roared without sound, "Father, move!" And somehow, Ned jerked his head aside at the last moment. Dawn's deadly arc sliced the air, catching only a few strands of Ned's dark hair. Ned's eyes widened in surprise, as though an invisible hand had tugged him away from certain death. For a moment, the young lord froze. Dayne, too, looked startled. As if from nowhere, Howland Reed shot forward, seizing the advantage. He swung his blade at Dayne's flank, forcing the Kingsguard to pivot sharply. Ned, breath rasping, quickly regained his balance. Bran sensed he had changed something, if only a fraction. But that fraction was enough for the swirl of events to shift. The past might no longer be the same. Bran felt an undercurrent of alarm. In the hush of the weirwoods he had left behind, the old magic groaned. But he could not let go now. In a flash of steel and fury, the fight intensified. Ned, spurred by his near death, fought with renewed determination. Howland circled behind, quick and agile despite his small frame. Meanwhile, the other Kingsguard pressed the remaining Stark men. Two more of Ned's companions lay bleeding on the ground, groaning piteously. Bran felt the anguish. He knew he could not save them all. Too many destinies had led them to this moment. But his father. If he could guide Ned from the certain killstroke, maybe he could ensure that his father would survive unscathed. Perhaps that would mean something in the future, though Bran could not guess what ripple it might send across the years. Blows clanged. Sir Gerald Hightower cut down another man, turning swiftly to face Ned. The White Bull was older, but he moved with surety, his broad sword carving wide arcs that forced Ned back a step at a time. Sir Arthur and Sir Oswald went advanced on Howland, who backpedaled, each breath ragged with exertion. Despite their dire predicament, Ned and Howland fought with the fierce loyalty that came from a shared purpose. The rescue of Lyanna Stark? The tower loomed behind the Kingsguard, a silent sentinel to all the blood spilled in its shadow. Bran tried to see if he could sense her presence within. But the pull of time and the tumult of the present moment was too distracting. All he heard was the rush of the wind and the beat of mortal hearts. Ned parried a brutal swing from Hightower, but the force of the blow rattled his sword arm. For a moment, it seemed he might drop his blade. Sir Gerald pressed forward, unrelenting, tears glinting in his eyes as if he lamented the necessity of this battle. Ned's foot slipped in the dust, and he began to topple. Bran felt panic surge. If Ned fell now, he would not rise again. Through sheer instinct or some subtle whisper from Bran's presence, Ned pivoted his shoulder and narrowly escaped another fatal blow. The edge of the sword caught a piece of Ned's armor, slicing through leather, but missing flesh. Ned rolled away, panting. One of the last of Ned's men, a tall, broad man whose name eluded Bran, charged in with a fierce war cry, forcing Sir Gerald to turn away from Ned. Their swords clashed, each blow accompanied by sparks. This gave Ned precious seconds to push himself up. Bran could see the tremble in Ned's arm from the repeated impacts. He had never known his father to show such vulnerability. But there it was, a mortal man, battered by war, battered by the knowledge that everything he loved rested on what happened here. Nearby, Howland Reed narrowly dodged a slice from Sir Oswell when the smaller man managed to duck under the knight's guard and rake his blade across Went's knee. The king's guard hissed and stumbled. Sir Arthur, noticing his comrade's danger, spun and attempted to deliver a punishing blow to Howland's side. But Howland twisted just enough to make it a glancing strike. Bran felt a welling of admiration for the Cronogman's skill and tenacity. This was the man who would later save Ned, who would whisper the truths that had shaped the realm's future. If only in the hush of secret. Perhaps it was that fierce loyalty that House Reed bore for House Stark. Bran felt it in his bones, the old alliance of men who swore to stand with the wolves of Winterfell. Time stretched and blurred in the swirl of dust. Each heartbeat was a moment of precarious balance between life and death. Bran's mind pulsed with the effort of holding himself in this time, sending the faintest wisp of guidance whenever Ned tottered on the brink. But with each push, Bran felt his consciousness flicker, as if the weight of centuries threatened to crush him. He could not remain here forever. Indeed, he was not even sure how long he could hold on. Every attempt to intervene risked the stability of the vision. Yet some deep part of him refused to let go, refused to watch his father die again, even if that death was decades away in King's Landing. He needed to offer what little help he could, if only to ensure Ned did not fall at the Tower of Joy. Ned's breath caught, and he raised his sword to block another swing from Hightower. Bran heard the jarring ring, saw Ned grimace from the impact. Blood trickled from a small gash in his scalp where an earlier blow had caught him. He would not last much longer at this rate. Urgency pounded in Bran's temples. He tried once more to push an impression into Ned's mind, to lend him a burst of energy or shift his footwork. Something he had gleaned from the training yard in Winterfell, or from watching knights spar. He recalled Robb's stance once, how Maester Luwin had praised his stable footwork. Maybe that recollection could help. Bran mustered all his will. He let the image of sturdy footwork fill his consciousness. Knees bent, weight balanced, a quick pivot. Perhaps it was nonsense. Perhaps it would do nothing. But he pushed it at Ned with the desperate hope of a child clinging to the last branch over a ravine. The dust whirled again, and Ned suddenly stepped with surprising agility, hooking his ankle around a half-buried stone to steady himself. He avoided a savage cut from Sir Gerald that would have torn through his mail. Ned's eyes flared with newfound resolve, and he riposted, driving the white bull back a half-step. Meanwhile, the tall, stark man who had distracted Hightower paid the price for his valor. Sir Gerald slammed the pommel of his sword into the man's temple. With a sickening crack, the man went down. Bran's vision almost blackened with the savage jolt of the blow. For an instant, he felt the horror coil in his chest. Death was ever so close here, as familiar as the biting steel. Ned cried out in anger at the loss of yet another companion. He lunged at Sir Gerald, forcing the older knight to block high. Their blades locked. Their eyes met, each reflecting the sorrow and determination that brought them to this field. Bran saw the muscles in Ned's arms strain. Then Ned twisted away, trying to slide his blade inside the King's Guard's guard. Sir Gerald was just as quick. Sparks flew. The ring of steel echoed across the empty land. On the other side of the battle, Howland Reed backed away from Arthur Dane, his breath ragged, a wound on his forearm dripping blood onto the cracked earth. Sir Oswell went, limping from the slash to his knee, clutched his sword in a white-knuckled grip, prepared to rejoin the fray. The fighting stuttered to a momentary pause as each man took stock. 5 of Ned's companions lay dead or dying, and the 3 Kingsguard, though wounded, still stood arrayed in their shining armor. Ned and Howland alone remained, battered and close to despair. Bran felt their desperation, the impossibility of it all. He knew the story said they would survive, but it had never said precisely how, beyond vague mentions that Howland Reed had intervened at a crucial moment. Now, the story was shifting under Bran's influence, each second threatening to unravel into something new. Arthur Dane's voice cut through the dust. "Yield, my lord," he said softly to Ned. "We need not spill more blood." There was sadness in his tone, and maybe something else. A final courtesy for a foe he admired. Ned's jaw tightened. He shook his head. "I cannot," he replied in a hoarse whisper. Behind them, the tower rose, silent witness to a secret that would decide the fate of kingdoms. Sir Arthur nodded, as if expecting no other answer. He raised Dawn and advanced. Sir Oswell, with a wince, limped forward. Sir Geralt circled to Ned's other side, pinning him between 3 foes. Howland Reed pressed close to Ned's flank, brandishing his blade with trembling hands. Bran realized the moment was coming, the heartbreak that would end in a swirl of dust and blood. In the old telling, the Kingsguard were whittled down by cunning or by unexpected means. Now, with the dance of steel and shadows changed, Bran feared an even more dire outcome. He could almost feel the equilibrium tipping. As the 3 white knights closed in, Ned and Howland braced themselves. Bran felt a tremor pass through him. He gathered what remained of his courage and tried to slip deeper, to find a mind more receptive to his presence. Ned's was filled with the thunder of the moment, the swirl of terror and determination. Howland's, though, flickered with an intense focus, a smaller flame that might be easier to cohabit. The Cranogman's mind was untrained, but not as battered by the immediate threat. In a heartbeat, Bran drifted, shaping his will into a slender thread. He recalled how he once warged into Hodor, how he had slipped inside the gentle giant's consciousness. But Hodor had been simple, innocent. Howland Reed was neither. This would not be so easy. Bran pressed forward, half expecting to be shunted away by the unstoppable tide of time. For an instant, he thought he felt a flicker of contact, as though Howland sensed a presence at the very edges of his awareness. Then the moment shattered. Sir Arthur lunged. Ned parried, but the blow jarred him to his knees. Howland sprang forward with a cry, slashing at Dane's flank. Dawn whirled in a shining arc, turning aside the smaller blade. Arthur Dane backhanded Howland across the face with his armored glove, sending him reeling. A cry rose in Bran's throat. No, not now. Not like this. He tried to push again, tried to slip inside. Pain seared through him, an excruciating sense of being torn in half. He sensed the great weirwood's branches quivering in the present, as if the watchers in the underground cave felt his overreach. But Bran did not let go. He clung to his father's memory, to the hope that this was not all doomed to repeat exactly the same. Some part of him believed he could buy Ned a few more heartbeats, maybe just enough to shift fate. He closed his eyes, or whatever passed for eyes in this spectral vantage. He felt the swirl of time's current wash over him. He heard the sharp intake of breath from Howland Reed. Then he felt the faintest opening, like a door trembling on weak hinges, ready to give way. He pressed himself through, gentle and insistent. A disorienting rush followed, a kaleidoscope of images. Howland as a boy among the swamps of the Neck, learning to hunt frogs, hearing stories of the Marsh King, forging an unbreakable loyalty to the North. The swirl made Bran dizzy. The deeper he went, the more he felt the pulses of the man's heart, the tension in his muscles. He tasted blood in Howland's mouth. And then, in the chaos, he heard his own voice. But it was inside Howland's head. Or maybe he was hearing Howland's voice. It was all so disjointed. At the center was an awareness: protect Ned. That single imperative, hammered into Howland's soul. That driving loyalty that overcame even the fear of the unstoppable swordsman. Bran latched onto it, guiding it, strengthening it. He steadied Howland's stance, lifted the blade in the crook of the man's arm. He fed a surge of focus, the memory of the way knights at Winterfell pivoted, the way they locked their shields. In the swirl of motion, he heard the ring of steel as Ned's sword caught Arthur Dayne's once more. Ser Geralt tried to close in from the side. Howland, emboldened by that intangible presence, lurched forward, slamming his blade against Dayne's, forcing the Sword of the Morning to shift his stance. Ned seized the chance and thrust at Ser Geralt, who twisted away just in time, though the blade bit into the side of his white cloak. Bran could feel Howland's heart hammering, each beat resonating in his ears. For a moment he was lost in the visceral reality of it. The dryness of the air, the sting of sweat in the eyes, the choking dust. Pain throbbed in Howland's jaw. He blinked, pushing away the tears that threatened to blur his sight. Ser Oswell advanced, sword raised, keen on finishing the crannogman. But guided by the subtle whispers from Bran's presence, Howland twisted, hooking his knife behind his belt and drawing a small throwing dagger from his side. Without hesitation, he flicked his wrist. The dagger flew, spinning end over end, narrowly missing Ser Oswell's face but grazing his ear and drawing blood. It was enough to force the knight to recoil in surprise. Ned roared and pressed his attack on Ser Geralt, driving him back. In that flash of advantage, Ned swung a wild blow that connected with the knight's shoulder. Steel grated on steel, and Ser Geralt staggered, though he did not fall. Sir Arthur advanced on Ned, pivoting away from Howland as if to strike the final blow. Bran sensed Dayne's intention, felt the man's deep regret. He was carrying out a duty he wished he had been spared, but no quarter could be given. Howland's body responded to Bran's silent urging, rushing forward in an attempt to distract Arthur Dayne. For a split second, Dayne hesitated, perhaps uncertain which foe posed the greater threat. That hesitation bought Ned another half-second to scramble away, searching for a vantage. Ser Geralt, wounded but not beaten, advanced again, sword ready. Time slowed in Bran's perception. Everything hinged on each man's next movement. He felt a terrible weight upon him, as if the entire realm's fate was balanced on a razor's edge. He guided Howland's step, repositioning so that the crannogman pressed in on Arthur Dayne from the side. It forced Dayne to turn, splitting his attention between Ned and Howland. Ned lunged at Ser Geralt, steel shrieking, driving the older knight further away from Dayne. Ser Oswell, still limping, swung wide at Howland, but the blow was parried in a clash of blades that sparked against the backdrop of the rising sun. Bran felt his strength waning. The strain of warging through time was draining him. His presence inside Howland threatened to slip. Each time Howland took a blow or moved too quickly, pain jarred Bran's awareness. He clenched desperately, as if wrapping invisible arms around a thrashing horse, trying to remain astride. His father was still outnumbered, still battered. The Kingsguard were wounded, but their skill remained formidable. The moment for cunning or trickery was now or never. Some flicker of a plan fluttered in Bran's borrowed mind. Howland's recollection of a bog devil trick, illusions with mud and reeds, ways to disorient a foe. Of no use here. Then the thought of an old song. A knight undone by a wound in the leg that crippled his stance. Ser Oswell was already limping. Could that be exploited? Dayne was near unassailable. But if he could be forced into a position where his sword arm was constrained, maybe Ned could land a decisive blow. The plan was murky, half-formed, swirling in the chaos. Yet desperation fueled it. Howland feinted at Dayne, drew another small knife from his belt, and hurled it low at Ser Oswell's wounded leg. Ser Oswell, eyes wide, tried to twist away, but the blade bit into his thigh. He grunted in pain, nearly collapsing. Blood gushed around the embedded steel. In that instant, Ned pivoted and engaged Arthur Dayne. The legendary knight tried to turn to help his comrade, but Ned's sword was there, scraping across Dayne's cuirass. Dayne parried and riposted. Bran felt the shock of that impact reverberate through Howland, though it was Ned who bore the brunt. Ned angled his blade, letting Dayne's sword glance off as best he could. The fight was savage, a whirl of steel and dust. Dayne's skill was unmatched, yet Ned was fueled by a cause he believed was righteous. Even so, the difference in skill was undeniable. Each time Ned tried to strike, Dayne's blade was there, Each time Ned defended, Dane's next blow hammered him a bit closer to ruin. Then came the moment Bran both dreaded and hoped for, the pivot in the old story. Howland Reed found some sudden chance to save Ned. But in the original telling, that chance had come when Ned was beaten down, left at Dane's mercy. Now the swirling fight had changed, and the exact outcome was uncertain. Sir Gerald and Sir Oswald were not yet out of the fight, though they bled. There might not be time for cunning. Dane pressed Ned, blow after blow, forcing him to yield ground. Ned stumbled, his left knee buckling. Dane swept Dawn downward in a final cut. Ned barely caught it on his sword, but the force slammed Ned's blade from his hand. It clattered across the stone and dust. Bran cried out silently, feeling his father's despair. Howland tried to lunge forward, but Sir Oswald intercepted him, sword hissing. Through sheer desperation, the Cranogman blocked and pushed, trying to break free. Ned was disarmed, on his knees. Dane stood above him, sorrow on his face. Dawn raised high, the blade shining in the first bright rays of morning. Bran's entire being howled in defiance. He poured everything he had left into Howland's limbs. With a feral twist, the Cranogman slammed his elbow into Sir Oswald's wounded leg. The knight crumpled to a knee with a cry. Howland tore away and leaped across the short distance to Sir Arthur's side. Dane began to bring Dawn down. At the last possible heartbeat, Howland dove, tackling the Knight of the Morning around the waist. The blow that would have split Ned's skull instead swerved wide, glancing off the ground in a burst of sparks. Arthur Dane staggered, trying to dislodge Howland from his waist. With surprising strength, the Cranogman held on. Dane shifted, wrestling for leverage. Ned, seeing the opening, scrambled for his fallen sword. His fingers closed around the hilt. Panting, heart-pounding, he pushed himself upright. Arthur Dane threw Howland off with a grunt, spinning to face Ned. Dawn rose again, but Ned lunged, blade aiming for the joint in Dane's armor near the shoulder. Dane tried to pivot, but a moment too late. Ned's steel slid between the plates, and Bran saw the sword sink into flesh and muscle. Dane gasped, eyes widening, and dropped on. He staggered, knees weakening. For a heartbeat, the hush was deafening. Ned's face contorted, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and horror. Arthur Dane sank to one knee, blood staining the white of his armor. He breathed raggedly, lips moving as if to speak. Ned knelt beside him, perhaps to hear his final words. Bran felt the wave of emotion that rippled through that dawn air. Heartbreak for a man known as the greatest knight of his era. Heartbreak for all the blood spilled. Heartbreak for what might yet be lost, or won in the tower looming behind them. Howland Reed pushed himself to his feet, trembling with the exertion of it all. Bran felt his senses fading, exhaustion creeping in, as if he had run a marathon across centuries. Sir Gerald Hightower, badly wounded and exhausted, dropped his sword with shaking hands, as if he could no longer stand. Sir Oswald lay prone on the ground, blood seeping from his thigh. Ned turned to them, but his gaze flicked to the tower. There, behind the stone walls, lay Lyanna Stark, the sister he had come all this way to save. Bran felt something within him unravel. The pressure of the past was too great. He could not hold this connection any longer. He felt himself yanked backward, away from Howland's vision, away from the swirl of dust and steel, away from the Tower of Joy. Then he was in the darkness again, the corridor of swirling memories and wood, the weirwood grove, the distant hum of ancient magic. His body, far in the future, jolted, sweat running down his brow. The memory of that final moment seared his mind. Ned alive, Dane mortally wounded. The other King's guards subdued. That was not how the old tales said it happened precisely, but it was close enough. Bran had intervened, and he had seen the shift. Ned had been saved, perhaps more quickly than he would have been otherwise. But what had changed? Bran gasped for air as if drowning. In the darkness of the cavern, he felt the old roots beneath him, heard the faint rush of wind through the tree above. Part of him ached with guilt, fear, and wonder. Had he done the impossible? Had he shifted the tapestry of history, even if only by a thread? Would that thread now unravel or hold firm, forging a new pattern? The knowledge weighed on him like a millstone. He whispered to himself that Ned had survived. That was what mattered. But a voice in his mind, sounding disturbingly like the three-eyed raven, murmured of consequences. As he sat there, chest heaving, eyes open yet unseeing, Bran felt more alone than ever, unsure whether he had done something truly monstrous or truly kind. The blood had been spilled. Perhaps that could never be avoided. But he had changed a death blow to a glancing wound. Had he saved Ned from another scar, or from a deeper wound to his spirit? He remembered the heartbreak in his father's face. Would it be lessened now, or only changed? He could not say. All he knew was that he had touched the past, and the past had shifted around his touch. Now, trembling in the waking world, he waited for the darkness to speak, for the old gods to react. But no immediate answer came. Only the slow drip of water, the quiet hush of roots settling, and the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. The Tower of Joy, he reminded himself, was not merely some random place in the annals of history. It was a crucible of fate, the site of a hidden truth that had defined the rebellion, reshaped crowns, and set the stage for future wars. By nudging that moment, had he also nudged the secrets within? The dreamlike haze of Warged still clung to him, and Bran felt both exhilarated and terrified. He had seen his father, fought to protect him. He had felt the swirling currents of time push back. And now, back in the cavern, he could do nothing but wait to see how the echoes might ripple through the ages, or if they would remain locked in that tower at dawn, witnessed only by the dust and the spirits of the old gods. Bran closed his eyes, letting the darkness of the present settle around him like a cloak. The memory of Ned's face floated before him, so real that he could almost touch it. The time for answers would come, but for now, he allowed himself a moment of gratitude and of dread. The Tower of Joy, once just a story told by old men, now felt closer than ever. The past had never been so intimately woven with the present, and Bran Stark, trembling in the roots of a dead weirwood, could only wonder what shape the future would take when next he opened his eyes. And he won. Bran's breath came in short, ragged gasps, as he felt the lingering tremors of that distant battle echo through his limbs. He was once more in the weirwood cave, though it seemed even darker than before, as if the roots and stone had closed around him in silent judgment. The chill air pressed heavily on his skin. Every corner of the cavern felt laced with a tension he had never quite noticed until now. The roots that intertwined through the earthen walls seemed to twitch, momentarily alive with some arcane awareness, as if the ancient gods were stirring in their deep slumber. He pressed his hands flat to the cold floor, half expecting the images of the Tower of Joy to rush back into his mind. Only the darkness greeted him. His eyelids drooped, and he nearly felt himself tipping to one side, weariness sapping his muscles of strength. The faint glow of a small fire flickered across the chamber, revealing Mira crouched at the edge of the light. She did not speak at first. Instead, she watched him with worry in her eyes, one hand resting on the butt of her spear. The hush that hovered between them was the hush of doubt and unspoken fears. "You were gone longer than before," she whispered at last, her voice as soft as a breeze rustling through tall grasses. "I tried calling to you, but your eyes were different." Bran swallowed and tried to steady himself. He could still taste the dust of that mountain pass, feel the dryness in his throat as though he had truly been there. "I saw something," he managed, unsure how to put into words the enormity of what he had done. "I went back to the Tower of Joy." Mira's expression flickered with recognition. Bran had told her pieces of that story before. The legendary fight his father had faced, the day House Stark nearly lost one of its pillars. The outcome had always been the same. But now, Bran hesitated, recalling how, only moments ago, decades ago, he had forcibly shaped the events of that blood-soaked dawn. The enormity of it pulsed behind his eyes like an oncoming migraine. Mira took a slow step toward him, uncertain. Is your father all right?" she asked quietly, as though fearful the question itself might cause him pain. "When you've gone before, you only watched. What was different this time?" Bran opened his mouth, but no words came. It was not that he was unwilling to tell her. He just did not know where to begin. He could see images of Arthur Dayne falling to his knees, of Ned's exhausted gaze, of Howland Reed's trembling hands. But was that the real memory now? Or had he replaced the original with a new version? The logic of it made his head spin. After a long silence, he managed to say, "I think I changed something." His voice shook with both awe and dread. "I couldn't just watch. My father, he was almost..." The words caught in his throat, and he dropped his gaze to the floor. "I helped him, Mira. I warged into Howland Reed. Or tried to. I don't even know if that's what truly happened. I only know I made sure father wouldn't die." "Then?" Mira's eyes widened, and she exhaled a quiet gasp. She reached out as if to steady him, or maybe to steady herself. But the three-eyed raven always said the past was unchangeable. Or that if we tried, we'd lose ourselves. Bran nodded slowly. He could feel the distant echo of that warning, the words slipping through his mind in the old man's gravelly tone. The past is written, the ink is dry. But that had not stopped him. It was as if something stronger than caution had compelled him forward. A love, a longing, and a refusal to watch Ned Stark suffer yet another heartbreak, if it could be avoided. Or perhaps he simply could not bear to see him die in that moment, though he knew Ned's end would come many years later in King's Landing. "The past, I don't know if it's truly changed," Bran said. "But I did something. I could feel it. And now, I don't know what that means for me, or for the realm." The final words left his lips in a shaky hush, and he braced himself for some tangible reaction. An earthquake beneath the cave, or a sudden thunderclap from the surface. But the chamber remained eerily silent, save for the crackle of the feeble fire. Mira let out a long breath. "You're alive, at least," she said, her tone gentler now, acknowledging that too many answers might be beyond their reach. Her gaze drifted to the bundle of furs where Bran sat. "Does anything feel different? Do you remember something you didn't before?" "Then Mercedes." Bran paused. Something did feel different, but not in any tangible way he could pinpoint. Rather, it was like a swirling tension in the very air, as if the patterns he was used to sensing in the Weirwood network were now in flux. The spirits of the old gods, or the echoes of them, seemed to hover at the edge of his awareness, watchful, wary. He closed his eyes again, searching for some trace of the future or the past that might have been warped by his interference. What he found instead was darkness. A thick curtain that refused to lift. He could see faint flickers of the Tower of Joy's aftermath. Ned kneeling by Arthur Dayne, Howland's face streaked with dust and blood. But the images were like impressions in murky water, half distorted, quickly fading. He pressed, but the vision wouldn't clarify. Like a stubborn door, it remained partially shut. He struggled to his feet, ignoring the tremble in his legs. He glanced around for his weirwood-carved throne or the hollow where he sometimes nestled. But he found only the cold stone behind him, the roots overhead. Blood rushed to his head, and he swayed, nearly toppling. Mira was there in an instant, her hands supporting him under the arms. "It's all right," she said firmly, voice woven with concern. "You're exhausted. I'll help you lie down." Bran wanted to protest, to push himself further, but a wave of dizziness left him groggy and drained of will. He let Mira help him toward a makeshift pallet of pelts. He could barely keep his eyes open. Perhaps it was the enormous strain of having forced his way into the swirling currents of the past. Perhaps it was simply relief that he had not lost himself in that memory. As he sank onto the furs, he felt Mira adjust a thick cloak around him. The cave's chill air settled over them like a watchful sentinel. Before he could gather his thoughts enough to speak, his eyelids slipped shut. Sleep was not peaceful. Fragments of memory whirled in half-lucid dreams. A tower, a woman's scream, a baby's cry, the glint of a white sword slick with fresh blood, and behind it all, the measured gaze of Ned Stark. In one moment, Bran saw the man smile as he once did in the courtyard at Winterfell, that gentle smile reserved for children. In the next, he saw Ned kneel in sorrow beside a bed draped with stained sheets. The images blurred, repeating themselves, until Bran found himself lost in an endless corridor of uncertain recollections. When at last he startled awake, the light in the cavern was different. The small fire had burned low, its coals flickering. Mira was asleep too, curled up with a fur across her shoulders, her spear laid within easy reach. Bran eased himself upright, trying to ignore the stiffness in his back. He scanned the dimly lit cave for any sign of movement. High above, through a crack in the rock, a pale light suggested dawn had arrived. He thought of the Tower of Joy at dawn, that harsh light reflecting off armor and steel. Even now, part of him still trembled at the memory. He breathed deeply. No matter what changes he had wrought, that moment was done. He was back in the present, and the tasks that lay ahead were as uncertain as ever. He began to wonder if he should attempt to slip into the Weirwood network again, to see if the realm beyond these caverns had shifted in some subtle way. Perhaps there was no difference, or perhaps there were immense consequences waiting to surface. The weight of it all clutched at him like cold fingers. Glancing around, he made sure Mira was still deeply asleep, and then tried to call out mentally, the way the three-eyed raven had taught him, reaching for the trees outside. He felt the faint hum of life, of crows perched in the upper branches, of wind rustling leaves. That was normal. But when he tried to extend his consciousness further, beyond the line of trees near the cave's entrance, he encountered resistance, a strange heaviness that pushed back at him. It was not an impenetrable barrier, more like a tangle of briars that slowed his progress. Or perhaps, he thought, the energy he had spent altering a memory was preventing him from traveling easily now. He shivered. The entire idea felt dangerous. Unease prodded him to stand. He wanted to check on the old man's remains, or whether presence lingered in the deeper recesses of the cave, to see if the ancient mentor might offer any silent sign. The three-eyed raven was gone, his body turned to dust and bone. Yet sometimes Bran still felt a fragment of his wisdom here. Bran's legs wobbled with fatigue, but he clenched his teeth and pressed on, leaning on the cold rock as he made his way further into the labyrinth of tree roots and twisting passages. The air quickly turned stale, thick with the damp smell of earth. Water droplets clung to the roots overhead, dripping occasionally into small pools. His footsteps echoed softly, a lonely sound. Farther in, the corridor opened into a broader chamber. Pale lichens shimmered on the walls, giving off a faint green luminescence. It was here that the three-eyed raven had once perched in that throne of roots, ancient eyes fixed on Bran's every movement. Bran remembered the posture of the old man's body, how fragile he had seemed. Now, the root throne sat empty. A few bones, bleached and brittle, rested near the base where the old greenseer had finally perished, though the rest were scattered in the dust. Bran swallowed, aware that he was trespassing on what might as well be a shrine. But he hoped for some sign, any sign, that might guide him in the aftermath of what he'd done. He knelt near the root throne. A hush settled over him, thick as a blanket. A few sparse leaves quivered above, the last remnants of the once-living canopy that threaded through the cave. Bran closed his eyes and placed one hand gently on the largest root, feeling the currents of ancient magic swirling just beyond his reach. He tried to slow his breathing, to ground himself in the steady pulsating rhythm of the old gods. He thought of how, when the three-eyed raven had first guided him, it was as though he'd stepped into a great river. Now that river felt choked with debris. The slow beat in his chest reminded him of a distant drum. He let himself sink deeper, even though fear nibbled at the edges of his mind. What if he encountered that same friction, that same barrier, and found that something irreparable had occurred? The notion clenched around his heart like a vice, but he forced himself to remain calm, inching further into the calm center of his being, searching for the small spark that let him commune with the trees. A faint whisper grazed his consciousness. At first, he thought it might be the echo of his own heartbeat. Then it came again, soft and insistent, like a breeze calling through the mouth of a cave. The words eluded him, yet the tone was unmistakably urgent. Bran pressed harder, beckoning it closer. Images shimmered in the darkness. The outline of a single weirwood tree, branches swirling, the rustle of bone-dry leaves. For an instant, He thought he glimpsed a shape beneath its boughs, a figure kneeling in the snow. He strained to see more, but the image was gone as abruptly as it came, leaving him with only the echo of that quiet whisper. He exhaled and opened his eyes, returning to the dim chamber. In his chest, his heart thudded like a captured bird. He sensed that the old gods, or whatever lingered of them, were aware of his deed. It was not condemnation he felt, exactly, nor was it acceptance. It was more like the hush before a storm, when all the forest creatures hold their breath, uncertain if the coming gale will pass quickly or devour them whole. He glanced at the old bones scattered on the floor. "What would you say if you were here?" he whispered under his breath, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Would you tell me I was a fool for trying? Or would you say there's no undoing it now?" In the silence, no voice replied. Only a single droplet of water fell from the root above, tapping a hollow stone and echoing through the chamber. Bran's shoulders slumped. There would be no easy answers from the dead. He gathered himself and slowly made his way back, supporting his weight on the walls as he went, mindful not to slip on the damp floor. When he emerged into the main cave, he saw that Mira was awake, crouching near the dying embers of the fire. She glanced up at him with relief. "You steady on your feet again?" she asked, rising to meet him halfway. Bran nodded, though he felt far from steady. She offered him a small ration of dried meat, which he accepted gratefully. The savory tang lit a spark of hunger in his belly, reminding him that he was still just a boy, with mortal needs, in a place saturated by ancient forces. They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the faint shift of wind told him morning was well underway. Mira watched him closely, but did not press him. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the complexity of what he faced. After they had chewed their scant breakfast, Mira stepped toward the cave entrance, spear in hand. "I'll see if there's anything outside worth gathering," she said quietly. "If you feel strong enough to move, maybe some fresh air would help." Bran did feel the pull of the open air, yet he remembered how he had struggled to push his consciousness, even to the tree line. A creeping unease twisted in his stomach at the thought that the world might look different now. Still, he mustered his resolve. "Yes," he said, summoning what steadiness he could. "I want to see the sky." With Mira at his side, Bran made his way along the winding passage toward the surface. The upward climb was slow for him, each small ledge requiring focus and effort to maneuver. She offered her arm in support when needed, but Bran was determined to do as much as he could on his own. At last, they reached the narrower opening that led to the outside, a jagged entrance half blocked by creeping vines. Light streamed in, somewhat dim and gray, but it was day all the same. The air that greeted them was crisp, laden with the scent of pine and damp soil. Bran inhaled deeply, letting that coolness wash over the musty smell of the cave. They emerged into a small clearing surrounded by towering evergreens. Patches of old snow still clung to the shadows, but the day's mild warmth had left the ground soft in places. The canopy above led through slivers of pale sunlight. As Bran blinked against the brightness, a crow cawed, fluttering from branch to branch overhead. Mira scanned the perimeter. Everything looked as it had, the same half-fallen trunks, the same tangles of brush, the same hush of the haunted forest. Yet Bran noticed a quietness in his own mind, as though the usual hum he felt when among the trees was subdued. He squinted, letting his eyes wander across the tall trunks, searching for that intangible connection to the old gods he so often sensed in leaves and bark. Instead, he sensed only a faint echo, a slight static. "Something's off," he murmured. The crow above gave another sharp caw, as if in agreement. Mira glanced at him, frowning. "Off how?" she asked. He shook his head, still unable to articulate the strangeness. "It's just quieter than usual." That was the best he could manage. Mira laid a hand on his arm but said nothing further. Perhaps there was no clear answer. They began a slow, careful walk around the clearing, Mira checking for small game, while Bran let his gaze drift over the tree line. The forest floor was strewn with pine needles, and his wheels, fashioned so he could move short distances, creaked softly as he guided himself with his arms. Despite the lingering cold, he found a semblance of solace in the light that cut through the branches. His thoughts drifted back to the Tower of Joy, playing it over in his mind like a half-remembered dream. Before, the story had ended with Ned surviving, but only through Howland Reed's cunning strike, one told in hushed rumor. Now, Bran had seen a different angle, nudged the confrontation in small ways. Perhaps the outcome was roughly the same, but small differences could mean everything. He remembered how Arthur Dayne had fallen. Would that shift the shape of Ned's memories? Would he recall, in half-waking moments, an impossible whisper in his ears telling him to dodge? Mira led them further along a narrow deer path, stepping lightly around a half-frozen puddle. Her eyes were keen, scanning the ground for tracks. She paused occasionally to bend and examine the mud, or to check the base of a tree for mushrooms. Bran gazed around, letting the silence fill him. The only sounds were their breathing and the occasional rustle of an unseen animal. It felt like a world in waiting. They paused when the path opened onto a small overlook. Far below, the land descended in rolling hills, shadowed by thick forests. They could see the faint line of a winding river, dark with meltwater. Overhead, the sky was gray and flat, but the light was strong enough to reveal a wide horizon. Bran felt a tug of longing, recalling how his father once described the vantage from the highest walls of Winterfell, or the top of the first keep. There you could see the beginnings of the Wolf's Wood and imagine the trackless wilderness beyond. He exhaled, leaning forward, and tried to let his mind spread out over the vista. Was the realm truly the same? He felt a flicker of movement in the back of his consciousness, a vague sense of crows flitting through the upper branches, but it was not as crisp as before. His link to them was hazy, as though a thin veil stood between them. Mira cleared her throat. "We won't find much out here," she said, pointing at the barren slopes. "There might be hairs deeper in the brush. Do you want to head back?" Bran nodded, though part of him dreaded going back to the cave's gloom. He did not know how to face the uneasy quiet that seemed to settle over everything. But at least there, in the sheltered darkness, he could try again to slip into a vision and see if any thread of the new future, or new past, made itself known. He turned the wheels of his makeshift chair. The path was bumpy, but Mira was there to support him if he got stuck. They retraced their steps, moving slowly, alert for any sign of danger or life. But no wolves howled in the distance, no deer bounded through the undergrowth. The forest felt like a place in between times. By the time they reached the cavern entrance, the gray sky had darkened slightly, as though thick clouds were drifting in. There was a sense of pressing gloom, like a storm or a heavy snowfall might be on the way. Once inside, Bran felt that same heaviness envelop him again. The claustrophobic hush of the cave made him want to press his hands over his ears. Mira set her findings, a few roots, some edible lichens, beside the embers. Then she slid to the ground with a sigh. "You should rest again, or at least try to reach out in the way you do. Maybe you'll see if anything is different, or maybe you'll find your answers." She didn't add that it might all lead nowhere. Her tone was hopeful, but weary. Bran gave a small nod. He positioned himself near the central part of the cavern where the ground was relatively flat. The cave's ceiling arched overhead, and faint lines of daylight seeped through cracks. He could feel the old magic seeping up through the stone, though it remained subdued. Closing his eyes, he pulled in a deep breath and reached for that intangible bond he shared with the weirwoods. It was easier to attempt here, in the place where the greatest root network branched outward, bridging the gulf between centuries. The initial wave of dizziness caught him by surprise. He fought the urge to reel away. Instead, he let his mind plunge deeper, inch by inch. He searched for the ghostly corridor that had once led him to Winterfell's Godswood, or the Isle of Faces, or even the distant vistas of the north. But as soon as he tried to follow those pathways, he felt them twist. The sensation was disorienting, like wandering a familiar street only to find all the doors locked and shuttered. He tried another approach, visualizing the trunk of the weirwood as a guide, letting the imagined branches cradle him. Slowly, the murky darkness in his mind began to reveal shapes. Like silhouettes behind a thin curtain, figures loomed and faded. It was difficult to maintain clarity. He saw glimpses of a heart tree's face, weeping red sap. Then, in the next flicker, A swirl of ravens took flight from a tower's balcony. Bran reached out toward them, but the vision dissolved. He pushed harder, ignoring the strain building in his forehead. All at once, he found himself gazing upon Winterfell's courtyard. It was the Winterfell of memory. Gray stone walls, a scattering of snow, the old well near the kitchens. He saw servants bustling about, carrying sacks, a few stable boys leading horses. It was so vivid, he could almost smell the straw. But something in the atmosphere was skewed, as though it was late spring or early summer. The brightness in the sky contrasted with the swirl of snow on the ground. A cluster of men were unloading crates from a wagon. There was no sign of Robb, or Sansa, or any face he recognized. He tried to move closer, to see if maybe his father was there, or a younger version of him. Then the courtyard shimmered and vanished. A wave of nausea hit him. He gasped, blinking his eyes open to the cavern. Mira leaned over him, concern etched on her brow. "Bran? Are you all right?" You started trembling. Bran rubbed his temples, trying to will the headache away. "I saw Winterfell," he breathed. "But I'm not sure which time. It felt different, like a mix of seasons. I couldn't hold it." His voice faltered, heavy with frustration. He had hoped for a coherent glimpse, a definitive sign, but all he received was a jumbled scene. Mira exhaled softly. "Maybe you just need more time to recover." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Do you think it's wise to keep pushing yourself? We don't know if that shift you made might have consequences that strain your abilities." He met her eyes, seeing the genuine worry there. He felt an echo of it in himself, but he also felt compelled to learn the truth. "If something's changed," he said, "I need to know what it is. My father's life. All those memories tied to that day. Everything that followed. Robert's rebellion. My mother's marriage to him. Me and my siblings being born. If the details shift, could it alter the future we've lived?" The idea was terrifying. He pictured 1,000 subtle threads unraveling, each one leading to a different outcome. For all he knew, he was no longer the same Bran Stark that had climbed the broken tower and fallen. Yet here he was, unchanged in body, with the same broken legs and the same half-formed green seer power. Mira was silent for a long moment. Then she placed a hand on his shoulder. "We can only move forward. If the old gods or the weirwoods meant for you to do this, then maybe they'll guide us yet. If they didn't, we'll still figure out a way. But you're not alone." Her words, soft but resolute, steadied his trembling heart. He nodded, swallowing hard. If he had learned anything from the tragedies that had befallen House Stark, it was that they endured through loyalty and perseverance. Mira was here, loyal and steadfast. That alone was reason for hope. They spent the rest of the day in near silence, venturing out occasionally to gather snowmelt, or scrounge for what meager edibles the forest offered. Bran dozed in and out of uneasy sleep, half expecting new visions to swarm him every time he shut his eyes. Instead, he found a deep fatigue that made him drift off without dreams. When he awoke each time, the gloom in the cave reminded him of the strangeness that surrounded them now. He kept testing the weirwoods in small intervals, trying to sense if the intangible hush was lessening. But it remained as thick as before. Nightfall came slowly. Mira used the meager fuel they had to coax a bigger fire from the embers, enough to keep them warm through the worst of the chill. They huddled near it, sharing whispered words about the tasks of survival. How much longer their supplies might last, when they should attempt to move on. Whether or not they dared to push deeper south, or remain near the cave. But always, the conversation circled back to Bran's visions, to the sense that his powers might be fragile after what he had done. At one point, when the fire was casting its dancing shadows on the cave walls, Bran lifted his head and said, almost too softly, "What if I made things worse?" His gaze flicked toward Mira, who looked back with empathy. "What if, by interfering, I let something else happen? Maybe Father's survival came at some hidden cost." Mira's expression tightened. "But your father did survive originally, didn't he?" she asked, voice quiet. "Just that day. Years later he was..." She trailed off, unwilling to say the words of Ned Stark's beheading. "You saw a chance to protect him in that moment. If the story ended the same way, Arthur Dane killed, the Kingsguard defeated, your father rescuing Lyanna, then maybe you didn't alter the outcome as much as you think. You might have only changed the details. That day was always a victory for your father, albeit a bitter one. Bran nodded slowly, but the seed of worry remained. It was a victory, yes, but I saw the way it ended this time. Father's sword struck Dane. In the legends, it was always Howland Reed who came from behind. The difference might be small, or it might be everything. Maybe Father's memory of it changed. Maybe it changed him. And now, he stared into the fire, remembering the look of heartbreak on Ned's face when he knelt over the dying knight. If that had been different, perhaps Ned carried new regrets. Maybe the entire realm's tapestry was a fraction off from what it was. Bran could not guess how that might ripple. Mira sighed, a soft sound that matched the crackle of flames. She rubbed her hands together for warmth. If you keep tormenting yourself with these questions, you'll never rest. We'll see if we can find a clearer path forward in time. Maybe once you're stronger, the weirwoods will open to you again, and you can see something more definitive. Bran made a non-committal noise in the back of his throat, eyes fixed on the dancing sparks. He recalled all he had learned from the three-eyed raven. That the gifts of Greensight were as much a burden as a boon. That seeing the future or the past could be a curse if one was not anchored by the present. He exhaled, letting the tension unravel just a little. Mira was right. He was too exhausted to accomplish anything else tonight. Before he lay down to sleep, however, he looked at her with quiet determination. Tomorrow, he said, I'll try again. I won't push so hard, but I have to see what is happening in the realm. We have to know if anything's changed that might affect us. Or the war. She gave a curt nod. I'll watch over you. Try not to lose yourself in those visions. Promise me. He offered a small, weary smile. I promise. The night wore on, lit only by the smoldering fire and the glow of the moon when it peeked through cracks in the cave ceiling. Bran's mind swam with half-formed thoughts, but at last sleep took him, plunging him into darkness. In the dim hours before dawn, he awoke with a start, skin clammy. He wasn't sure why. His dreams had been quiet, or at least he couldn't recall them. But there was a feeling in his chest, an insistent tug, as if someone far away was calling his name. He propped himself up on one elbow, breathing shallowly. The fire had nearly died, but a few threads of orange light glowed in the ashes. Mira was asleep again, curled on her side, spear within reach. Bran swallowed, trying to calm the pounding of his heart. That invisible thread was still there, pulling at him, faint as a distant star. With trembling resolve, he shut his eyes and reached out to the weirwood magic again, letting the gentle pull guide him instead of forcing it. The darkness behind his eyelids shimmered. A swirl of images blossomed, faint but distinct. Ned Stark's face, lined with sorrow, older than at the Tower of Joy, as if many years had passed. His father stood in some chamber lit by torches, the heavy cloak of the north draped over his shoulders. He was speaking to someone Bran couldn't see. On the wall behind him hung a banner, the direwolf of House Stark. The image shifted, melting away, replaced by the faint outline of a white wolf in the snow, a shape that might have been Ghost. Then that too dissolved, replaced by the broken towers of some distant castle. Bran tried to focus, to bring the vision into sharper clarity. But it was like trying to hold sand in his fists. Each time he tightened his grip, it slipped away. At last, he let the vision fade, breathing out a ragged sigh. Maybe it was only his own muddled memories, mixing with the weirwood's echoes. Yet he felt something else under it, a pattern he did not fully comprehend. The next morning arrived with a thin, watery sunlight. Bran and Mira roused themselves, shook off the aches of sleeping on stone, and broke their fast on small bits of dried meat. Bran told her of the flickering visions, though he could not put them in order. She listened intently, her eyes thoughtful. Then she handed him his fur cloak. What if you try again now, she suggested. The day's light might help, and your strength might be better. Bran took a moment to consider. His head felt clearer than it had the day before, though the dull ache in his muscles remained. He nodded. All right, but stand by me. If I start thrashing around or something odd happens, pull me out." She agreed, setting herself close. Bran closed his eyes again, letting his palms rest on the rocky ground, feeling for that pulse of ancient energy. This time, the barrier was not so dense. He slipped inward gently, mindful of how he directed his thoughts. The swirl of weirwood memories felt uneasy, like a sea churned by an unseen storm. But at least he could drift along its surface, peering at the reflections there. He let the present recede, imagining that the cave's darkness was merely the inside of his eyelids. Then, slowly he pushed forward, seeking a vantage point that might reveal how the realm had, or hadn't, changed. Images whirled, glimpses of a tall castle perched by the sea. Pike, perhaps, or another stronghold of the Iron Islands. A swirl of desert wind crossing the red sands of Dorne. The faint shapes of riders moving along a dusty road. Each scene flickered and vanished, replaced by another, until Bran felt himself tilt with the speed of it all. He tried to hone in on the north, on Winterfell, or even the Trident, but the swirl was chaotic. Eventually he let himself drift, hoping that something would stand out of its own accord. At last, he latched onto a distinct image. The great hall of Winterfell, with its vaulted ceilings and long rows of benches. The hearth was ablaze, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Men milled about in cloaks of gray and brown. At the far end stood a figure upon the dais, speaking in a strong, commanding voice. Bran squinted, trying to make out the face. It took a moment for it to come into focus, but when it did, his heart lurched. It was Ned Stark, but older, as if in the prime of his lordship. The lines of worry were etched deeper around his mouth and eyes. He wore a thick cloak trimmed in fur, and ice, the great sword of House Stark, was belted at his side. He seemed to be addressing a crowd of bannermen. Bran felt a wave of relief and longing. All at once, he gazed upon this father he had lost. The man spoke, though Bran could not hear the words. The vision offered only a silent tableau. Yet Ned's posture was firm and his expression pensive. Something weighed on him. Bran tried to glean details. The table behind him was set with newly extinguished candles, as if a meeting had run through the night. Men in Stark livery stood around. Another man, older and balding, was gesturing vehemently. The silent argument pressed on. Bran watched, helpless to interpret. As he floated closer, he saw Ned lower his head, as though bracing for a difficult announcement. Some of the men nodded, others shook their heads. It looked like the end of a council, the faces set in worry or anger. One man even pounded his fist on the table. The hush of the vision pressed in on Bran. He wished he could hear them, to glean what matter they debated. Then Ned's gaze turned, scanning the hall, and for a heartbeat, Bran thought his father's eyes flickered in his direction. An illusion surely, but it sent a thrill through him. Then the image dissolved without warning. Bran caught his breath, jolting back to the cave. His eyelids flew open. Mira's steadying hand was on his arm. He blinked a few times, disoriented. The cave's gloom rushed in around him. He swallowed, trying to cling to the memory of that silent vision. "Did you see something?" Mira asked, leaning forward. Bran nodded, each breath shaky. "Winterfell. My father, standing in the great hall." He looked older than he was at the Tower of Joy, but still younger than when. He let the words trail off. "It was as if I was glimpsing a moment in his lordship, years before Robert's death maybe. Or maybe it was another time altogether. I couldn't tell, but there was an urgency in the hall." Mira frowned thoughtfully. "That might not be new, you know. Your father led Winterfell for years. He had many councils, many moments of worry. The realm was never without troubles." Bran considered that. She was right. It could have been just another day in Ned's life as Lord of Winterfell. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that it was important, that it tied to what he had changed. There was a tension in that council scene that hinted at a crisis. He wondered if it concerned the Iron Islands rebellion, or some conflict with the Lannisters, or something else entirely. Could it be that Ned was shaping new alliances in the aftermath of a subtly changed history? The speculation churned in Bran's mind. He sucked in a breath. Maybe I need to see more. He braced himself as if to dive back into the swirling visions, but Mira gripped his shoulder firmly, stopping him. "You're exhausted," she insisted. "These repeated attempts are wearing you down. You can't do it all at once." She gave him a small, apologetic look. "I'm worried, Bran. You're pale. Your hands are shaking." He glanced at his hands and saw that she was right. His fingers trembled as though a current of nervous energy ran through them. The veins stood out on the backs of his hands. He let out a slow breath, realizing how taut his body felt. "All right," he relented at last, though a part of him chafed at the limitations of flesh. "I'll rest. But we can't linger in this limbo forever. We have to decide whether to stay here or move on." Mira nodded solemnly. "We'll give it a day or two. Gather what we can. If your visions don't become clearer, or if you don't regain your strength, we'll head south. Maybe find a safer refuge." Their plan agreed upon, they settled into a routine. Bran spent the next day and night in cautious attempts, never pushing too deep, only skimming the edges of the weirwood network. He caught glimpses of random scenes: a weirwood grove in a summer rain, a half-ruined hall somewhere on the neck, a boy running across a field of tall grass. None of it offered clarity. It was as if the realm's tapestry had been ruffled, and only fleeting images rose to the surface. All the while, the sense of hush in the forest persisted. At night, Bran would peer at the sky through the cave's cracks, and wonder if the old gods were withholding their voice, punishing him, or simply waiting to see how events might unfold. And in every quiet moment, the memory of his father's face at the Tower of Joy returned to him. Despite the turmoil he felt, one undeniable truth rang clear. Ned Stark had lived that day. He had gone on to rescue Lyanna, returning north with heartbreak in his heart and a secret in his arms. That was the foundation of the story. Perhaps, in the grand scheme of destiny, Bran's interference had only shifted pebbles along the path. But pebbles could become avalanches under the right conditions. Finally, on the third morning since Bran's reckless journey into the past, the wind changed. Bran and Mira woke to a distinct chill in the air. A light snow had fallen in the night, dusting the clearing outside with a fresh layer of white. Mira stoked the fire, and Bran sat up, trying to gauge his strength. He felt steadier, as though the 2 days of partial rest and gentle testing had stabilized him somewhat. He met Mira's gaze. "One more try," he said softly. "Then, if I still see nothing useful, we'll plan to move on." She nodded. "All right. I'll be here. Go carefully." Bran closed his eyes and exhaled. The quiet swirl of weirwood magic felt less hostile now, as if time had tempered its resistance. He imagined the old gods watching, not with fury, but with the same eerie calm that had seen generations of men rise and fall. He let his consciousness drift into the roots. A gentle pull guided him, no longer the raging storm it had been before. He reached for the thread of familiarity, the sense of belonging that tied him to the heart trees. Shadows parted, revealing a corridor in Winterfell's crypts. The ancient stones loomed on either side, torch sconces flickering. Bran recognized the line of statues, each carved in the likeness of a dead Stark. Wolves at their feet. He drifted along in silence, feeling the chill air that never quite vanished down there. The corridor bent, revealing a smaller chamber at the end, a place of recent entombment. He blinked, unsure which generation's bones he might find. Then a figure appeared, hooded, kneeling before one of the statues. Bran tried to see the face, but the figure's back was to him. He floated closer, heart pounding, uncertain of what he might uncover. The figure murmured something. A name, perhaps. But the words were lost to the vision's silence. Then, as if sensing another presence, the hooded person turned slightly. Bran caught a glimpse of dark hair, a sharp profile, a mouth pressed into a sorrowful line. He inhaled sharply. It was Ned Stark, older still, perhaps the age he'd been right before traveling south to become the Hand of the King. Bran froze, torn between longing and dread. In one hand, Ned clutched something, a small wreath of winter roses. He laid it on a stone coffin. Bran's vision drifted, letting him see the name on the tomb. It was too dark to read clearly, But the posture, the presence, it must have been Lyanna's final resting place. Ned bowed his head. A moment of profound sadness emanated from the man, so intense that Bran felt tears threaten to well up in his own eyes. Then Ned spoke a single silent word. Though Bran couldn't hear it, he read the shape of his father's lips, so familiar from childhood. Sorry. A wave of heartbreak surged through Bran, and the vision dissolved. He came to with a start, lying on the cold cave floor, tears on his cheeks. Mira's hand was pressed to his forehead. She was frowning. "You cried out," she said. "Are you all right?" Bran wiped at his cheeks. "I saw father again, in the crypts by Lyanna's statue. He was older, placing winter roses." The memory weighed on him like a yoke. He said he was sorry. Mira's brow furrowed, but she didn't press. She only gave his shoulder a comforting squeeze. Bran stared at the bare stone ceiling, mind churning. Ned's sorrow had been raw, as though even after all those years, the Tower of Joy haunted him. Perhaps that heartbreak was always meant to be. Saving Ned from a mortal wound hadn't changed his grief over losing Lyanna, or the guilt he must have carried for all that transpired during Robert's rebellion. What if that was the crux? Some events were destined, while others were malleable. He closed his eyes, letting out a trembling breath. In the swirling tapestry of time, maybe he had only diverted the smallest thread. Enough to keep his father from a deeper wound, or from losing another loyal companion. That might not change the day's final outcome, nor the burden that Ned would carry back to Winterfell. If that was the case, then perhaps the realm's broad strokes remained the same. Yet a lingering question gnawed at him. Had that small shift led to subtler repercussions that he had not yet glimpsed? The quietness in the Weirwood network suggested that something was amiss. But it might take time for that difference to grow into a visible branch of fate. Bran was not certain he would ever see it clearly, not unless he mastered his powers in ways beyond his current ability. The thought left him both relieved and uneasy, standing on the brink of knowledge he could not fully grasp. He turned to Mira, meeting her eyes. "I think we should leave," he said softly. "We've learned all we can here. There's no direct sign that the realm itself has shifted drastically. If there are changes, they're hidden. We can't spend our lives in this cave waiting for them to reveal themselves." "Then at security." Mira nodded. "Then we'll gather supplies and head south, or at least somewhere with better shelter. Maybe we can find out if there's word of anything unusual in the outside world. Stories that might hint at a difference in the past." Bran let out a weary sigh. The uncertainty weighed on him, but also a trace of hope. If the realm was not drastically undone by his interference, maybe he had not committed some unforgivable sin against fate. Perhaps he had simply given his father one less scar on that bloody morning. If that was all, then he could bear it. They set about preparing for the journey, packing what dried rations they had, bundling furs, quenching the fire. Outside, the snow had resumed, swirling in gentle flakes across the evergreens. Bran's breath plumed in the cold air as he looked back at the cave entrance, wondering if he would ever return to that subterranean nexus of memory. The fear that he might still be punished for bending time's rules lingered. But no thunderbolt fell from the sky. No monstrous shadow emerged from the trees. Only the wind, whistling softly through the boughs. With Mira's help, he made his way onto the trail, leaving deep ruts in the fresh snow where his chair rolled. A pair of crows fluttered overhead, their caws echoing through the silent forest. Bran paused, glancing up at them. For a moment, it seemed they were regarding him curiously, as if they too wondered what he had done with the past. He lifted a hand, half in greeting, half in farewell, and the birds flapped away, vanishing into the swirling white. He continued on, forging a path that wound southward, away from the hidden valley where the three-eyed raven had once guided him. The trees loomed, skeletal and silent. Mira trudged ahead, parting the undergrowth with careful thrusts of her spear, keeping her ears pricked for danger. Bran followed, mindful of each branch or root that threatened to catch a wheel. Though the journey was arduous, a small spark glowed in his chest. He was free of the cave's oppressive hush. Whatever changes he'd wrought, he would face them head-on. As they moved deeper into the forest, Bran thought again of the Tower of Joy. of Ned standing in the first rays of dawn, battered and bloodied, but alive. Perhaps that was the shape of history all along. The blood would still have flowed, the secret still kept. Ned would remain the same honorable man he'd always been, shaped by sorrow but guided by love. Bran allowed himself the faintest smile, an ember of reassurance. Someday, he resolved, he would delve deeper into the weirwoods, charting the hidden channels of fate to see if any subtle branch had grown from his intervention. But for now, he would live as Bran Stark, forging a path in the real world, carrying that single hope, that a son's love might span even the distance of years, offering a father one more chance to stand beneath the dawn sky. Alive, if only for a moment longer, and perhaps just a bit less burdened by the horrors of war. In that small difference, Bran felt a kernel of peace, like a candle flame shielding him from the dark. The snow fell steadily, blanketing their tracks behind them. Overhead, the sky remained cold and gray, but Bran lifted his eyes to it with quiet defiance. Whatever lay ahead, whether changed or unchanged, he would meet it, bearing within him the memory of that dawn, when he had reached across time to save the man who had always, and would always, shape so much of his heart. And if the old gods were listening, perhaps they understood. Sometimes, even in a realm of unyielding destinies, the power of love could carve a new path. And sometimes, that small path was all that was needed. They set out under a pale sky streaked by hesitant sunlight. The snow whirled around them in gentle flurries, coating the ground in a thin blanket that tugged at the wheels of Bran's chair. Mira led the way, pushing aside low-hanging branches and tangles of brush, so Bran could ease forward without snagging. The forest loomed in a labyrinth of dark trunks, each step accompanied by the muffled crunch of ice and snow underfoot. Overhead, crows occasionally flapped from branch to branch, their distant caws echoing among the silent pines. Bran kept glancing at them, wondering if they carried messages from the old gods, or if they were merely hungry birds waiting for scraps. He could not sense their minds the way he once did. A lingering heaviness in his chest reminded him that something was changed, or perhaps he was simply too tired to reach them. Despite his anxious thoughts, the air felt fresher than it had in the cave, and though the cold bit at his cheeks, he welcomed the open space. Mira paused every so often, scanning for signs of a path or a break in the undergrowth. The going was slow, and noon was little more than a faint brightening in the gray sky. Bran's arms soon ached from pushing the wheels over ruts and stones hidden by snow. Nevertheless, he forced himself onward, determined to leave behind the weighty hush of that underground chamber. That hush had lingered in him like a second heartbeat, reminding him of the day he had risked everything to pull at the threads of fate. They stopped to rest near a fallen spruce that shielded them from the wind. Mira offered Bran a water skin, which he drank from gratefully, wincing at the chill of the liquid. Then they shared a small strip of dried meat, barely enough to quell hunger, but it would do. Bran flexed his fingers to keep warm. His breath hung in pale clouds as he looked around for any sign of life. There were faint tracks in the snow, perhaps made by rabbits or a fox, but no sign of anything larger. Mira crouched, examining the tracks. "We might catch something if we set a snare," she said. "But it's risky, lingering in one spot." Bran nodded, though a part of him longed for a proper meal. "We'll keep going," he said, trying to sound resolute. "We need to find a better shelter tonight. Something more than a cave or a hollow log. Maybe there's a village or a holdfast farther south." Mira shouldered her spear, offered Bran a quick nod, and moved ahead. The air grew colder as the hours passed, and Bran felt a deep ache in his shoulders. But he remained silent, letting Mira guide him over the uneven terrain. Though the snow concealed obstacles, she was skilled at picking out stable ground, occasionally cutting away stubborn branches that blocked their route. Over time, the forest canopy thinned, giving way to smaller pines and a scattering of birch. The sky overhead took on a dull whiteness that promised more snow, or perhaps freezing rain. They pressed on until the afternoon light began to fade. The forest rose and fell in gentle swells, and they started to descend into a valley where the snow grew deeper. Bran could smell the faint tang of a river, though they had not yet seen one. Mira stopped at the top of a low ridge and pointed downward. Through the clustered trunks, Bran could make out the sloping shapes of old farmland, overgrown by brambles and young trees. It looked like a place that once might have been inhabited, now reclaimed by nature. Mira glanced at Bran. "There could be a farmhouse or a cottage left standing," she said. "Or a barn. Anything that might give us a roof for the night." Bran felt a stir of cautious hope. "Let's look." The prospect of something more hospitable than an open forest, where the cold sank into one's very bones, was alluring. And if they found people, perhaps they would hear news of the outside world. That thought quickened his pulse. What might the realm be like now? Was there any whisper of events that branched from his meddling in the past? They descended into the shallow valley, maneuvering around patches of thick brush. With each yard, the signs of old fields became clearer. Toppled wooden fences, half buried by snow, and the faint ridges where crops once grew. Beyond a line of saplings, they found a narrow dirt path, hardened by frost. The tire marks of Bran's chair followed the path more easily, so they took advantage of it, forging deeper among the bracken. Then, in the distance, they spotted the dark silhouette of a small structure, slumped and sagging, but still standing. They advanced, the wind picking up. The structure emerged from the gloom as a modest barn with a collapsed roof on one side, the walls leaning precariously. Nearby stood a smaller hut, half choked by vines. Bran exchanged a glance with Mira. Even a crumbling shelter might be better than none. They approached cautiously, scanning for any sign of recent activity. The doors to the barn hung from rusted hinges, leaving a gap wide enough to peer in. Inside they saw rotted timbers, some scattered straw, and shadows that stretched into corners. No immediate movement. No fresh tracks in the snow. Mira made her way around the barn's perimeter, spear at the ready, while Bran waited near the entrance. He listened, heart thumping, expecting some wild creature to dart out. Only silence greeted him. When Mira circled back, she shook her head. "I see no footprints aside from ours. No fresh droppings either. It's empty." They ventured inside, picking a spot near the remaining portion of intact roof. A few shards of dusty hay lay in a corner, offering the faint suggestion of insulation. Mira sighed, setting down her pack. "We can clear a space and build a small fire. The smoke might escape through the broken roof." She cast her eyes upward, where a gash in the boards let in a slice of dusky light. Bran nodded, weary. He felt gratitude at having any roof at all, no matter how unsafe it looked. Mira began gathering splinters of broken wood. Outside, the light quickly faded, the sky turning a dull gray that blended with the snow-covered fields. Before long, darkness settled over them. The only illumination came from Mira's careful attempts to spark a flame. She struck flint against steel, the scrapes echoing in the hollow barn. Soon, a faint glow flickered in the tinder. Bran watched, half dozing, as flames licked upward, casting long shadows on the leaning walls. They shared their scant food and huddled close to the feeble fire. The barn creaked in the wind, each gust rattling the boards. At any moment, it felt as though the entire structure might collapse. But for the time being, it held. Bran dozed, drifting in and out of uneasy dreams. In one, he was riding in a sleigh across a vast white tundra, searching for a tower of red stone. In another, he saw the crypts of Winterfell again, lit by flickering torchlight, and Ned's face haunted by sorrow. But each time he tried to speak or reach out, the dream dissolved. He awoke to find the fire nearly burned out. Mira dozed at his side, curled in her cloak. The hush of night pressed in. Outside, a faint glimmer of moonlight hinted that the clouds had thinned. Bran listened to the barn's slow groans, to the rustle of wind through the broken slats. His stomach rumbled, and he tried to ignore the hunger. He thought of Winterfell's great hall, of the feasts that once filled the trestle tables. How impossibly distant that seemed now, like a memory from someone else's life. With a soft sigh, he closed his eyes again. This time, he did not slip into dreams. Instead, he hovered in a half-sleep, drifting on the edge of memory. Some part of him was still trying to reach across time to see if the Tower of Joy had truly shifted the realm in ways unseen. But no vision came. Only darkness. At dawn, They found the world outside blanketed in a fresh layer of snow. They shook themselves awake, stiff and groaning from the cold, and decided to keep moving. The barn had served its purpose, but it offered no supplies, no warmth beyond their failing fire. Bran's limbs felt numb as he settled into his chair, and Mira's cheeks were raw from the night's chill. At least the snow had eased. The sky was a milky white, with a hint of pale sunlight near the horizon. They followed the dirt path away from the barn, weaving through what remained of the old farmland. Soon, they passed the half-collapsed hut. Inside, they glimpsed a skeletal table and scattered debris. It offered nothing of use. Pressing on, they reached a rutted trail that wound through a copse of young trees. The land sloped downward, promising a river or creek ahead. Bran took in the signs, the shape of the valley, the direction of the wind. He tried to recall the maps he'd seen at Winterfell, to guess how far north or south they might be. Geography had never been his strength, and the world looked different under blankets of snow. But he suspected they were somewhere east of the Gift, or the lonely hills near the last river. The hours wore on. Mira occasionally stopped to set small traps in likely spots, hoping to catch a hare. They had so little to eat that any morsel would help. Bran waited while she worked, scanning the tree line for threats. He saw only the drifting swirl of snow and the occasional flash of a bird's wing. Once she finished, they continued southward, intending to circle back to check the snares the following day, if they remained in the area. By midday, they had covered a league or more. The path widened slightly, skirting what might have been a wagon route in better times. Bran recalled traveling such routes with his father's household guard in summers past. It had always felt like an adventure, with the promise of new sights and friendly small folk offering bread and salt. Now, the stillness weighed on him. The north had become a quiet land of ice and vigilance. War had scarred it. And beyond war, there was the threat of the others, which loomed on the edges of the world. Was that threat changed by his meddling in the past, or had it remained the same, heedless of mortal shifts? Shortly before the sun dipped toward the horizon, they spotted smoke in the distance, a thin column rising above the trees. Mira halted, her spear clutched tight. Bran squinted, trying to see any sign of a settlement. The trail snaked downhill, and the rising ground blocked much of the view. But where there was smoke, there might be a hearth. And if it was a village, they could seek shelter, or at least learn what news the folk carried. The question was whether it would be friend or foe. They exchanged a look. Mira shifted her weight. Could be hunters, or a small camp, or a homestead that's still occupied. Are you willing to risk it? Bran thought of the alternative, another night in a ramshackle barn, or worse. I think we have to risk it, he said quietly. We won't survive much longer scavenging. We need real shelter. Maybe they'll have something to trade or spare. Mira agreed, so they continued. The path descended into a shallow ravine, the trees crowding close. It felt as if they were walking through a tunnel of gray trunks. The smoke drifted lazily overhead, shifting in the wind. Gradually, the smell of burning wood reached them, faint but unmistakable. Bran's heart beat faster. It had been weeks, maybe months, since they had encountered any semblance of normal human habitation. Caution warred with hope inside him. When they finally emerged from the trees, they found a small clearing, ringed by a crooked fence. Within stood a low stone house, its chimney issuing the thin plume of smoke. A few outbuildings clustered nearby. One might have been a pen for livestock, though it was empty now. The yard was covered in fresh snow, with a narrow footpath, trampled down near the doorway. Someone clearly lived here, or at least visited regularly. Mira lifted a hand, signaling Bran to wait while she crept forward a few steps. Scanning for movement, she saw none. Bran inhaled, then called out in a clear voice. "Hello?" His words echoed in the stillness. There was no immediate answer. He tried again, louder this time. The wooden door to the stone house remained shut, its surface dark with age. For a moment, he wondered if perhaps the inhabitants were hiding. But then, the door creaked open a hand's width, and a woman's face appeared. A few strands of gray-brown hair framing wide, wary eyes. She regarded Bran and Mira with open suspicion. "Who are you then?" she called. Her voice had the accent of a northerner, thick and low. Bran cleared his throat. "Travelers," he said, pitching his voice so it wouldn't waver. "We mean no harm. We're just cold, hungry, and in need of shelter." "Nah." The door opened a bit more. Bran could see the glint of a small blade in her hand. She was middle-aged, her cheeks ruddy from the cold. "Not many travelers come this way," she said warily. Mira raised her free hand, palm out to show she bore no immediate threat. "We've journeyed from the north," she said simply. "We were hoping to find a safe place to rest. We'll pay what we can, or do what chores you might need, if you can spare room." The woman's eyes flicked from Mira to Bran's chair. She saw the layers of furs wrapped around his legs, perhaps the exhaustion in his face. Her gaze softened just a fraction. She stepped outside fully, revealing a stout body wrapped in a threadbare cloak. She kept her blade at her side, though not pointed at them. "This isn't an inn," she said gruffly. "There's hardly enough for me and my husband. But come in if you must. Mind your manners, or you'll regret it." With that, she gestured them forward. Mira looked to Bran and he nodded. They approached slowly, letting the woman see they had no intention of violence. Up close, Bran realized the stone house was barely large enough for 2 or 3 people. The door was narrow, so he would not fit inside with his chair. He braced himself for an awkward transition. The woman realized the problem. She muttered something under her breath, then opened the door wide and beckoned them to a meager threshold inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single lantern and the coals of a small hearth. The main room was cluttered with rough-hewn furniture, tools and baskets. A kettle hung over the fire, sending up scant wisps of steam. The smell of onions and turnips wafted through the space, making Bran's stomach rumble painfully. A second figure stirred in the corner, an older man with a wiry beard, sitting on a stool. He had a hunting bow propped against the wall. Though his eyes were bleary, he seemed alert enough to reach for the bow if needed. "Name's Farron," the woman said as she closed the door behind them. She kept her knife in hand. "This is my husband, Tybalt. We're all that's here." Mira inclined her head. "I'm Mira, of House Reed, sworn to the Starks of Winterfell. This is Bran." She seemed to hesitate before calling him Stark. Usually they avoided revealing Bran's identity so openly, but a proud note slipped into her voice nonetheless. "We thank you for letting us out of the cold." Bran studied their faces, unsure if claiming House Stark would provoke hostility or reverence. The man, Tybalt, shifted on his stool. "Starks of Winterfell, eh?" he said, almost under his breath. He exchanged a look with Farron, whose face flickered with an emotion Bran couldn't read. "Is Ned Stark still your lord then?" Farron asked, her tone guarded. Bran's pulse jumped. This was exactly the question he had dreaded, the place where small differences might arise. Mira answered quickly. "He was. Times have changed. Word might not travel easily. You've heard of what happened in King's Landing." She paused, cautious. "Lord Stark was named Hand of the King but was executed some time ago." Her words sounded bitter, as though repeating a memory still raw. Farron and Tybalt exchanged a puzzled glance. "We heard rumors of trouble in the south," Tybalt said, voice raspy, "but not that Ned Stark was executed. That can't be true. Not if he's in Winterfell, or was not too long ago. Heard talk of him from a trader passing by in the fall." He frowned, confusion etched into his lined face. Said Lord Stark was holding his seat. People were worried about the Ironborn, or so the merchant claimed. Bran's mouth went dry. This was it. A ripple of something different, or a rumor twisted by distance. He locked eyes with Mira. She had gone very still. "You're certain the traders said Lord Stark was in Winterfell?" she asked quietly. Tybalt shrugged. He was an older fellow, but seemed sure enough. Spoke of a meeting Lord Stark held with his northern bannermen. Folks said maybe he was gathering a host. Didn't say for what. Then, Bran's heart hammered. That was not how the history had gone in the timeline he remembered, where Ned Stark traveled south, was arrested, and beheaded. The realm had been plunged into chaos under King Joffrey. leading Robb to declare himself king in the north. Now, these people spoke as though Ned had never been taken prisoner. Yet Bran knew he had seen with his own eyes the tragedy in King's Landing. Or so he had believed. Could the rumors be false, or had something indeed changed? Farron, still gripping her knife, narrowed her eyes. Which is true then? Did something happen to Ned Stark in the south, or is he safe at Winterfell? We've no love of kings down here, so long as we're left be. Mira swallowed, turning to Bran for help. Bran felt dizzy, as if time itself were slipping beneath his feet. It's complicated, he managed, voice trembling. We heard that Lord Stark was betrayed in King's Landing, but news can be slow to reach the far corners of the north. It might be that he's returned or was never truly. He broke off, unable to shape the sentence. None of it made sense. For a moment, the memory of Ned Stark's face in the crypt came flooding back. Older but unbroken by the captivity that had once doomed him. Could this be the manifestation of Bran's intervention? Farron frowned, looking between them. Lot of mysteries in the world these days, she muttered. At least you're not Ironborn, or wildlings. Stay by the fire if you like. But we've little to spare. She gestured toward a spot on the floor near the hearth. The house was cramped, leaving no space for Bran's chair. Mira helped him shift to a small stool, where the warmth from the embers reached his feet. The flicker of heat was a blessing after the day's cold. Bran stayed silent, his mind racing. Tybalt scraped the last of whatever stew they had into wooden bowls. The smell made Bran's stomach clench painfully with hunger. Farron looked uncertain, then placed a bowl in front of them. Though she said, "That's it for the day. We'll have to hunt again tomorrow." She seemed reluctant to share, but not unkind. Mira bowed her head in thanks, and Bran murmured gratitude. They ate slowly, the thick broth of onions and turnips tasting like a feast after days of near starvation. As they ate, Farron and Tybalt spoke in low tones, mostly about the hardships of winter, the need to avoid bandits, and the risk of roving wolves. Mira asked carefully about any other travelers or signs of an army marching, but the couple claimed ignorance. They lived off trapping and meager crops in the warmer months, rarely journeying beyond a few leagues. Sometimes a merchant or peddler passed along news or rumor, but that was all. They were too far from major roads to see much traffic. When the meal was done, the two resumed their chores, tidying what they could. The tension remained. Mira tried to lighten the mood by offering to help fix a damaged window shutter, but Farron refused, saying she would deal with it herself. Tybalt sat on his stool, hawk-like eyes on Bran, as if trying to puzzle out the truth of these strangers in his home. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. The gray light of afternoon was swiftly slipping into dusk. Eventually, Tybalt set aside his bow and pointed to a corner where old blankets were piled. "If you're staying the night, bed down there," he said, voice gruff. "Don't expect comfort. We'll keep watch by turns. We don't know you, you don't know us. That's the way it is." Mira nodded. "We appreciate any kindness you can spare." She helped Bran make his way across the cramped space to the corner, where she arranged blankets. The fire's heat didn't fully reach that area, but it was better than freezing outside. Bran sat in silence for a while, letting the tension thicken. He needed to talk to Mira in private, to parse the meaning of Tybalt's rumor that Ned Stark still held Winterfell. At length, Farron and Tybalt drifted to their own small sleeping alcove across the room, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the whistling wind. Bran and Mira huddled close, speaking in hushed tones. Could it be that word simply never reached them about Ned's death? Mira asked. The North is vast. Rumors can be twisted, especially if they rely on a single traveler. Maybe he was mistaken. Nedams. Bran licked his lips, unsure. "I saw Father's End. Sansa and Arya saw it too. It happened." Yet his voice faltered, remembering the visions of Ned alive in Winterfell's hall, in the crypt, older than he should have been. Unless something changed. The Tower of Joy might be a pivot. Or perhaps Father was never forced south in the same way. But that leads to so many contradictions. Robert named him hand after Jon Arryn's death, and that was before war truly ignited. Could a different detail at the Tower of Joy changed such events years later. Ned. Mira's eyes flicked to the shadowy form of Farron and Tybalt, making sure they weren't listening. If your father's injuries were different, or if his reputation changed subtly, maybe that altered Robert's decision or the timing of it. Or perhaps Ned returned from the rebellion with a slightly different standing among southern lords, enough to shift alliances. She exhaled, rubbing her arms for warmth. It's not impossible. But we're dealing with guesswork. We need more credible news. Nain. They lapsed into a weighted silence. Bran thought of the vow he had made, that he would face whatever consequences arose from his meddling. Now those consequences loomed, intangible yet undeniable. The Ned Stark who once marched to King's Landing to unravel the Lannisters' secrets might not have done so in this version of events. Or if he had, the outcome was different. But how did that reconcile with the memories that Bran and his siblings still carried? He felt as if his mind were split between two realities. Night pressed onward. Tybalt banked the fire, and the house grew darker. The air was filled with the sense of smoke, boiled onions, and old straw. Every so often, the rafters creaked in the wind. Bran and Mira nestled together, drifting into a fitful sleep. Bran's dreams were filled with confusing images. He saw a banner of the direwolf snapping in a strong wind atop the walls of Winterfell, heard the echo of Ned's voice calling out commands, and glimpsed the faint shape of Jon Snow riding away under a pale moon. But everything was fragmented, swirling, as though viewed through cracked glass. He woke with a start sometime in the night. The coals glowed faintly, and he heard Tybalt shifting about near the hearth. The man was presumably standing watch. Bran's heart pounded, and he closed his eyes again, letting the restless swirl of thoughts subside. At last he fell back into a dreamless slumber. By morning, a pale light crept through the shuttered windows. Farron stirred, grumbling about the cold. She stoked the fire, tossing on a few pieces of kindling from a sparse woodpile in the corner. Tybalt pulled on his boots and cloak, preparing to step outside, likely to check traps or fetch water. Before he left, he cast a glance at Bran and Mira that suggested he was still far from trusting them. While he was gone, Farron handed them each a tin cup of weak tea, the steam rising in faint tendrils. The hot liquid soothed Bran's parched throat, and he uttered thanks. Farron only nodded, crossing her arms. "You'll be moving on today, then?" she asked bluntly. Mira looked at Bran. They both understood that the hospitality here was strained. Bran nodded. "Yes. As soon as we can." He paused, deciding to venture a question. "Could you tell us anything else about that traveling merchant? Where he might have come from, or where he was heading?" She shrugged. "He was heading south along the river roads. Said he aimed for White Harbor, maybe, to unload some furs. Claimed he'd been to Winterfell, or at least close by. Talked of a new steward in the Stark household, or something like that. I didn't pay much mind. Not sure where he came from originally." Bran's pulse beat faster. "Do you recall how long ago he passed?" "Late in the fall," she said. "Leaves hadn't quite fallen yet, so maybe 2 moons ago. A little more." He tried to quell the rising churn of uncertainty. If that man had truly been to Winterfell or near enough, it meant that, 2 moons ago, Ned Stark was alive in the seat of his power. Bran knew that in the old timeline, his original memory, Ned had been dead far longer than that, killed during the early days of King Joffrey's reign. There was no easy explanation, except that reality had somehow bent. He managed to nod, though his mind reeled. Farron eyed him. "You look troubled. You expecting war to come again?" She spat near the hearth. "We got no love for any lords, but the Starks treated folk fair enough from what I hear. Better them than Lannisters or Freys. Still, war's war." Mira took a careful breath. "We can't say for sure, but thank you for sharing what you know." She rose, gently stretching her limbs. "Tybalt should be back soon and we'll be on our way." Farron just grunted, turning back to the hearth. They lapsed into silence. Bran finished his tea, each swallow flooding him with warmth. He silently mulled their next move. If Ned Stark was indeed alive, it might change everything about how they traveled. Could they safely go to Winterfell now? The possibility both thrilled and terrified him. He pictured seeing his father again, older, but not the man who had marched to King's Landing. Yet the questions multiplied. Would Ned even recognize this Bran, who had known a different fate? And what of his mother? His siblings? A knot formed in Bran's stomach as he realized how complicated it could be. Then again, the desire to see Ned alive was a pull so strong, it almost felt like a physical ache. Tybalt returned in a swirl of cold air, stomping the snow from his boots. He carried 2 meager rabbits, newly caught, and he threw them onto a small table. Snared these near the stream, he grunted to Farron. Then he shot a look at Bran and Mira. If you're heading out, best to do so soon. The snow's not letting up. They gathered their meager possessions. Mira helped Bran back into his chair, which had spent the night just outside the door, propped beneath a little overhang. By the time he was settled, the couple was already huddled over the rabbits, discussing how to stretch them for the next few days. Farron glanced over once, as if to make sure their guests weren't pilfering anything. Mira thanked them again for the shelter. Bran offered a quiet farewell, though his head was still spinning. Outside, a light snow drifted from pale clouds. They followed the trampled path away from the house, slipping past the fence that marked the boundary of Farron and Tybalt's small holding. When they were out of earshot, Mira exhaled hard. So it's not just a rumor. They heard it from a merchant who sounded certain that Ned Stark was in Winterfell. That's quite a difference. Bran nodded, the cold stinging his cheeks. It means that either this merchant lied, or father never died in King's Landing. Or if he did, something reversed it in a way that shaped rumors to the contrary. But I can't see how that would make sense. Even if the realm wanted to spin tales, it wouldn't account for him physically being there. She chewed her lip, scanning the sky. Could your interference at the Tower of Joy have caused a chain of events that let him avoid going south altogether? Maybe he recognized a danger sooner, or changed how he handled Robert. Or perhaps Robert never pressed him to come be Han. Bran remembered that Ned had originally gone south only after King Robert arrived at Winterfell in the wake of Jon Arryn's death. The three-eyed raven told me the past was already written, that events had a shape that couldn't be undone. But I did something. Maybe only a small shift was needed to reshape the lines. Nenor. Mira's brow furrowed as she walked beside him. The snow squeaked under her boots. If that's so, then what about the War of the Five Kings? The rise of King Joffrey? The fates of your siblings? Could all that be changed? Maybe Robb never called the banners. Maybe the North didn't break away. The entire realm could be different now. Bran felt a chill not caused by the weather. In his memory, Robb had been crowned king in the North after Ned's execution, rallying Northern lords to war. That war had shattered so many lives. If Ned had never been executed, Robb might have remained the heir of Winterfell, never leading an army south. It was a relief in one sense. No red wedding, no broken alliances. But then, what of Sansa, Arya, and Rickon? He had no clue where they might be in this altered shape of history. A deep longing surged in him. If he could return to Winterfell now, might he find them all safe? Or would he discover a host of new heartbreaks? He stared at the snow-laden path. "We have to know the truth," he said at last. "If Father truly lives, we have to see him. I have to see him. Maybe he'll understand. About the tower. About me." The thought of explaining it made his pulse race, but it was also an irresistible hope. To look upon Ned's face again, to speak with him as a living man, was a dream Bran had never dared to imagine once he'd known of his father's death. Mira nodded, though wariness flickered in her eyes. "We can try. But Winterfell is far, and the roads may be dangerous. If the realm is different, the dangers might not be the same as before. We have to be careful." They pressed on, deciding to follow the path south until they found a main route that might circle back west toward Winterfell. Though it sounded counterintuitive to travel further south, Bran knew that the forests directly west could become treacherous, full of dense pine and rocky hills with no clear roads. If there was indeed a traveler's route near the river, that might give them a safer passage. So they trudged on, stopping only when Mira set a small snare or scouted for a place to cross streams. The first day passed with no great event. other than the swirl of questions in their minds. That night, they camped beneath a broad fir whose branches formed a natural canopy against the falling snow. They managed a small fire, just enough to melt some water and keep from freezing. Mira roasted a squirrel caught in one of her snares, a meager meal for two. Bran swallowed each chewy bite, tasting only hunger. But the excitement of the possibility that Ned Stark lived made it easier to ignore the rumble in his gut. When the fire crackled low, they spoke in hushed tones. Bran asked if Mira thought his siblings might also remain in Winterfell in this new version of events. She admitted she had no answers. Arya might not have run off. Sansa might never have been betrothed to Joffrey. Rickon and Robb might be safe behind Winterfell's walls. Or perhaps they had scattered in different ways. Each scenario brought more questions than answers. At some point, exhaustion weighed Bran down, and he slept. His dreams were jumbled. He saw the crypts of Winterfell yet again, only this time the statues were covered in frost, the faces obscured by a soft haze. He heard Ned's voice echo down the corridors, calling Bran's name in a tone of mingled hope and alarm. Bran tried to follow, but the passages shifted. He found himself climbing the external walls of the castle, like he once did as a child, hands and feet seeking purchase in the ancient stone. Then he was falling, the ground rushing up, and he jerked awake, panting, heart racing. Morning light found them wrapped in cloaks stiff with frost. Mira stirred the ashes of the fire, searching for any leftover warmth to spark a flame. They prepared to move quickly, limbs stiff from the cold. The day brought a faint sun that turned the snow's surface into a blinding glare. Bran squinted under the brightness as they continued onward. By mid-afternoon they heard the rush of a river, and soon they glimpsed the glint of water through the trees. Mira led the way to a narrow path along the bank. Here, the snow was less deep, though the air felt damper, and patches of ice lined the river's edge. They followed the river south for another day, occasionally encountering the remains of fishing huts or old campsites, but no living souls. The tension grew the farther they went, the sense that the world was holding its breath. On the afternoon of the third day since leaving Farron and Tybolt's homestead, they finally reached a crossroads. A wider road, partially cleared of snow by the wind. It curved westward, as if heading toward known northern lands. A wooden signpost leaned at an angle, too weathered to read easily. Mira rubbed some frost from it, making out the faded letters. One arrow pointed vaguely northwest, the other southeast. She brushed off more ice, squinting. That might say White Harbor to the southeast. So this road leads from there, up toward the heart of the north. If White Harbor's that way, then Winterfell should be this way. She tapped the crooked arrow. Bran's spirits lifted. This was a real road, or at least close enough. If travelers still used it, they might encounter more news, or more people willing to trade. Without hesitation, they turned onto the road that bent northwest. The next 2 days blurred in a steady grind of travel. They encountered no one, though the road showed the faint tracks of old wagon wheels now packed with frozen snow. Occasionally they saw crows overhead, or glimpsed deer darting through a glade. They ate whatever Mira could hunt or trap. Their progress was painfully slow, given Bran's need for careful navigation. At night, they slept beneath trees or in small abandoned huts. The huts they found had evidently belonged to peasants or crofters who had fled or died, leaving behind rotted beams and empty hearths. Always the question burned in Bran's mind. Was he drawing closer to a father still alive in Winterfell, or was it a false rumor? He tried to reach out in that quiet, inward way, hoping to slip into a weirwood dream for clarity. But the glimpses he caught were too fleeting. A swirl of red leaves, a fleeting shape of Ned Stark in profile, a wind that carried faint whispers. Nothing conclusive. He prayed silently to the old gods, to the memory of the three-eyed raven for guidance. The forest gave no answers. On the fourth day along the road, they saw the distant outlines of a wagon, its silhouette creeping along the snowy landscape. Mira stiffened, beckoning Bran to slow. The wagon was small, drawn by a single horse, with a figure hunched at the reins. They waited, hearts racing. If these travelers were bandits, they would have the advantage. But if they were merchants, It might be a chance to confirm the rumors of Ned Stark. The wagon halted when its driver spotted them. The figure, wrapped in furs, raised a hand in wary greeting. Mira did the same, glancing at Bran to gauge his reaction. They moved closer, and Bran saw it was a man well into his 50s, with a salt and pepper beard. His face was tired but not unfriendly, and he gripped the reins in one hand, a short bow lying across his lap. He eyed Bran's wheeled chair with curiosity. "Hail, strangers," he called. "You travel in uncertain times. Which way do you go?" Mira approached first, spear at her side, but not raised. "North," she said, her breath misting in the cold. "Toward Winterfell, if the roads allow. We've heard conflicting news." The man's brows lifted. "You and everyone else. Winterfell's quiet for the moment, last I heard. Lord Stark was gathering men, but no war's come this far yet." And then, Bran's heart leapt. He willed himself to remain calm. "You've been there?" he asked, voice trembling. "Close enough," the man replied, squinting. "I was in Barrowton, traded a few goods from White Harbor. Folks said they saw some of Stark's riders passing through on their way east. Seemed official enough. Must be a call for lords or men-at-arms. Hard to say. Didn't stay long. I had my own route." Bran swallowed. "So, you're certain Lord Eddard Stark is in Winterfell?" He heard the quaver in his own voice. The man shrugged. "As certain as a traveling merchant can be. It's not a secret. Surprised you don't know. Of course, rumors in the south say he was executed by the Lannisters. But that's hogwash if you ask the north. We'd have heard if anything so dire happened. The man's got a wife, a brood of children, a whole realm of bannermen. He's not the sort to vanish." Bran stared, hardly breathing. Mira thanked the merchant softly, passing him a piece of cloth she had used to wrap cured fish, an unspoken gesture of courtesy. He accepted it with a curious nod. "I won't delay you," he said, tugging the reins. "But winter's no season for long roads. Best keep your eyes open for direwolves, or worse." With that, he urged his horse onward. They stood there in the middle of the road, snow drifting around them. For a long moment, Bran could not speak, overwhelmed by the confirmation. Ned Stark lived. There was no longer any doubt, unless an entire swath of the north was part of some grand hoax, which was beyond reason. Mira's eyes shone with stunned relief and apprehension. She looked at Bran, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Bran's heart thundered, joy and dread mingling in an impossible tangle. "Father is alive," he breathed at last. Saying it out loud made it feel both wondrous and terrifying. Ned Stark, who had died in King's Landing by the cruel order of King Joffrey, was alive and ruling from Winterfell. Everything Bran had known about the war that followed was now uncertain, or perhaps never happened. He felt an odd pang of guilt for the thousands who had died in that war. Had his intervention truly spared them, or had some other conflict replaced it? Mira laid a hand on his shoulder. "If he's in Winterfell, we go to him," she said softly. "We must see him." "But, Bran, what then? Will you tell him what you did?" Bran shuddered at the thought. He pictured Ned's steady gaze, the firm line of his mouth when confronted with strange or dishonorable news. Yet if anyone could hear the truth, it was Ned Stark. Bran could not imagine lying to his father. And yet, how could he explain that he had reached back in time, twisting the events of the Tower of Joy? The ramifications blurred in his mind. They resumed their journey, each push of Bran's wheels in the snow feeling heavier with the enormity of what lay ahead. The path continued northwest, weaving between rolling hills. Occasionally, they saw footprints that suggested other travelers had passed, though none in the immediate vicinity. The merchant's words echoed in Bran's ears. Lord Stark was gathering men. For what reason? Perhaps trouble brewed with the Ironborn or beyond the wall. Or maybe Robert Baratheon still sat the Iron Throne, asking Ned for support. So many possibilities that once would have been shaped by the war over Joffrey's succession. The entire shape of politics in the Seven Kingdoms might have changed. They paused at midday, their fingers numb with cold. Mira scouted the area for game, leaving Bran alone by a cluster of boulders. While she was gone, he let his eyes slip shut, hoping to sense the weirwoods, The swirling hush that had plagued him since the Tower of Joy lingered, but he felt a faint stirring of something, a thread of power. He latched onto it, seeking any vision that might offer clarity. Darkness turned to faint images, a swirl of white snow, the courtyard of Winterfell, Ned's face set in stern determination. Bran tried to push deeper, to glean some conversation or event, but it was like looking through a frosted window. He saw Ned gesturing to assembled men as if giving orders. Then the image faded, leaving only an echo of the word, king. Bran's eyes flew open, heart pounding. Was Ned the king in the north? Or was it another king he addressed? When Mira returned empty-handed, they continued on, not speaking much. Over the next few days, they covered more ground, forging through stretches of forest and across frozen streams. At times, the track was clear enough that Bran could roll unimpeded. At others, Mira had to help lift the chair over fallen branches. They spent nights in hollow groves or under rocky overhangs. Their food remained scarce, though they managed a few squirrels and winter hares. Constant hunger wore on them both. Still, the promise of reaching Winterfell spurred them on, even when the wind blew harsh and the nights were brutal. Each day, the land grew more familiar to Bran in subtle ways. He recognized the shape of hills, the certain bend of a river that fed from the west, the tang of pine in the air that reminded him of hunts with Robb. Memories flickered, colliding with the knowledge that this was not quite the same timeline. He sometimes felt disoriented, like a traveler between dreams. At last, after countless days of slow progress, they crested a rise at twilight and beheld a broad expanse of land below them. Far in the distance, nestled against a wide river, stood the faint silhouette of Winterfell's walls. The towers rose against the winter sky, their shapes familiar yet almost ghostly in the gloom. Smoke rose from the chimneys, a testament to the fires within. Bran gazed upon it, tears burning his eyes. How many times he had dreamed of returning to Winterfell, and in every dream, he had known his father was gone. Now that stark certainty wavered. They made camp in a small copse, waiting for daylight to approach the castle. Neither wanted to stumble toward the gates under cover of darkness, uncertain of who kept watch. They shared their last bit of salted hare, the morsels scarcely enough to fill a child's belly, and sipped melted snow from a battered tin cup. After the fire burned low, they huddled together, silent in thought. Bran could barely rest, images of what tomorrow might bring swirling through his head. Morning dawned cold and clear. The sun cast long shadows across the snow as they descended toward the outer fields that lay before Winterfell. Bran's heart thudded with every rotation of his chair's wheels. Mira walked beside him, her spear strapped across her back to appear less threatening. From a distance, they could see the outline of the gates and the watchtowers. Smoke from the kitchens drifted lazily upward, tinted gold in the early light. As they neared, a pair of mounted guards emerged from a small gatehouse near the walls, no doubt spotting them on approach. The guards wore cloaks of mottled gray and carried spears. One raised a hand, commanding them to stop at arrow's range. Bran and Mira complied, hearts pounding. The guards studied them warily. "Halt there," called one. "State your business in Winterfell." Bran forced his voice to be steady, though his heart felt ready to burst. "I am Bran Stark," he said, letting the words ring in the frosty air. "Son of Eddard Stark. I have been away a long time, but I have returned." The guards exchanged stunned looks. One peered closer, taking in Bran's dark hair, the lines of his face and the wheeled chair. There was confusion there, and caution. "Bran Stark?" the guard repeated. "We heard young Master Bran." He halted mid-sentence, shaking his head. "I'll fetch the Castellan at once. Don't move." "Not anymore." They retreated, leaving Bran and Mira waiting on the open field. Bran felt the blood roaring in his ears. Had these men believed he was dead? That was likely in the old timeline, but in this new one, who knew what was rumored or recorded? Time seemed to slow to a trickle. At last they saw movement at the gates. A small party approached, guards, and among them a man wearing the badge of the direwolf. He had graying hair and a measured step. Bran recognized him as Vayon Poole, once the steward of Winterfell, though he remembered hearing that Vayan had died or gone to King's Landing in the past. Vayan Pool's eyes were round with shock as he drew close. He stared at Bran's face, then at the furs around his legs. "Gods be good," he said softly, removing his glove. "How is this possible?" Bran swallowed. "It's me, truly," he said, voice thick with emotion. I've come home." Vayan looked to Mira with a searching gaze. She gave a polite dip of her head. "Mira Reed, of Greywater Watch," she murmured. Bran's companion and protector. The steward exhaled, breath curling in the cold. "Well, come inside, my lord. My gods, Lord Stark will want to see you at once." Bran's chest felt tight, tears threatening. He and Mira followed as the guards led them through the outer gate. The courtyard lay beyond, bustling with activity, stable boys leading horses, servants hauling firewood, men-at-arms drilling with spears. Bran recognized the smell of the kennels, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer striking iron. It was Winterfell, as he had always loved it. A wave of memory nearly overwhelmed him, running across these stones on sturdy legs, climbing the broken tower, playing with Rickon. Now he came in a wheeled chair, a stranger to those who watched him with wide eyes. Murmurs spread through the courtyard. Faces turned to stare. "It's Bran Stark," someone whispered, disbelieving. The hush of awe and confusion rippled among the watchers. Bran kept his gaze forward, trying to steady his breathing. One guard gently pushed his chair to help navigate the uneven ground. Mira walked at his side, a silent pillar of support. They passed through the second gate, into the inner ward. Bran felt a surge of anticipation so strong it nearly made his heart burst. They came to a set of stone steps leading into the great keep. The steward paused, glancing at Bran's chair. "There's a ramp in the rear corridor," he said, somewhat apologetically. We built it for." He stopped himself, uncertain how to explain. "Forgive me, come this way." They circled around to a side entrance with a wide slope of wooden planks laid over the steps. It was crude but serviceable. Bran realized with a jolt that it must have been designed for someone else who couldn't walk. Or perhaps for him, in a different iteration of time. Everything felt surreal. The guards guided them up, and into a stone corridor lit by torches. Warm air struck Bran's face, carrying the smell of roast meat and bread from the distant kitchens. He swallowed, nerves tangling inside him. They reached a heavy wooden door, guarded by two men in Stark livery. Vayan Pool gestured for them to stand aside. One guard knocked, opened the door, and ushered them in. Bran's heart hammered. This was a solar of some sort. A private chamber. He saw a large table strewn with maps and parchments. A fire crackled in the hearth, lending the room a comfortable warmth. And there, standing by the table, was Ned Stark. He looked older than in Bran's last memory at Winterfell, yet younger than the haggard prisoner of King's Landing. His hair was shot with more gray at the temples, his face lined with quiet cares. He wore a simple tunic of dark gray, a cloak of wolfskin across his shoulders, and his gray eyes were calm, focused. For a heartbeat, Ned seemed not to comprehend what he was seeing. Then his expression broke, shock and disbelief mingling in his features as he stared at Bran. "Bran," he said, voice hushed. The single word carried years of anguish and hope. Bran felt tears slip down his cheeks, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted to stand, to run to his father, but he could only grip the arms of his chair and stare, overwhelmed by the reality of the moment. Ned took a trembling step forward, as if uncertain whether this was real or some cruel dream. Then he sank to one knee beside Bran's chair, reaching out a hand. Bran grasped it, feeling the solidity of his father's calloused fingers. That simple touch shattered any final doubts. They clung to each other in silence, tears shining in both their eyes. Mira stood back, head bowed respectfully, as if sensing the gravity of the reunion. Ned spoke first, voice raw with emotion. "My boy, we feared you gone, lost forever. How can this be?" He cupped Bran's face gently, searching his eyes. Bran swallowed, words tumbling in his mind. "There's so much. Father, He could scarcely breathe. Ned pulled him into a tight embrace, arms around him. And Bran felt the ache of years melt into that moment of profound relief. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of his father's presence wash over him. In that embrace, the horrors of the war, the fall from the tower, the flight from Winterfell, and even the haunting memory of Ned's death, all blurred into a single wave of raw emotion. When Ned finally eased back, his gaze flicked to Bran's legs and the chair. Pain and compassion mingled in his expression. "You've been hurt, I see. But you're alive." He glanced at Mira, then at the guards who lingered near the door. "Clear the room," he ordered softly. The men hesitated but obeyed, ushering out all onlookers, including Vayan Poole. Soon, only Ned, Bran and Mira remained in the solar. Ned turned his attention to Mira. "You have my deepest thanks. You must have kept him safe on the roads. I know House Reed is ever loyal." His voice wavered with gratitude. Mira bowed her head. "He kept me safe as well, my lord. I only did what any loyal vassal would do." Ned nodded, but his eyes soon returned to Bran, as though he could not bear to look away for long. "Bran, we thought you lost when the Ironborn threatened the coasts but that's a tale for another time. Please, tell me, how are you truly? And where have you been?" So much lay behind his questions, an entire landscape of longing and confusion. Bran felt the weight of it, the urge to pour out every secret. But how could he begin? His throat felt dry. "I don't know where to begin," he said, voice trembling. I've seen things, done things I can't explain. But I had to come home." He looked into his father's face, searching for any hint of the man he once knew, or the father he had watched die in another life. He found only love and relief, tempered by the lines of a lord who had borne many burdens. "I need to tell you everything," Bran whispered. "But it's a long story." Ned placed a hand on Bran's shoulder. "Then you'll have the time. You'll stay here in Winterfell with your family. We'll face whatever comes next, together." He spoke with the quiet certainty that had always comforted Bran as a child. At those words, tears threatened again. The dream he had clung to for so long, returning home, hearing his father's voice, was now real, if strange and new. The ghosts of King's Landing and the Tower of Joy drifted at the edges of his mind. He felt Mira's reassuring hand on his back, as if to steady him. His heart pounded with the knowledge that he must tell Ned about the tower, about the danger of the others, about everything. But for this single moment, he let himself be a son reunited with his father. "I'm home," he whispered, the words tasting of both relief and lingering dread, because behind that moment of joy stood the specter of all that had changed, and all that might yet unravel. But for now, Ned Stark's eyes shone with the same gentle warmth Bran had cherished in the Winterfell of his childhood. And if the old gods watched from their ancient trees, perhaps they understood that love, too, could be a force strong enough to reshape the course of kingdoms.